Chapter 9. Personal Magnetism. Perhaps the most interesting manifestation of mind power along the lines of telementation and mentative induction, at least to the beginner in the study of the subject, is the phase known as personal magnetism. We may as well begin by considering the use of the word magnetism in connection with mental influence, etc. We often hear of personal magnetism, mental magnetism, magnetic personality, magnetic attraction, magnetic influence, etc., etc., used in the sense of mental attraction, personal influence, fascination, charming, psychological influence, etc. Let us see just why the term is used. The explanation involves an interesting bit of little-known occult history. The word magnetism, of course, arises from the word magnet. Now here is an interesting bit of history. You will see in the dictionaries that the term magnet was given the lodestone, or natural magnet, because it was first discovered near Magnesia, a town in Asia Minor. This explanation is most amusing to those familiar with the records of the old occult brotherhoods, for the latter know that instead of the magnet being named after the town was named after the magnet, the latter being known centuries before the town of Magnesia was built. The natural magnet was known in China, India, and Persia thousands of years ago. Its name magnet arose from the same Persian word as magic, namely, mag signifying the esoteric priesthood or Magians. The name was given because the power of the natural magnet resembled the mental power exerted by the Magians, and the stone was called literally the Magian stone, or the magic stone, hence the words magnet and magnetism. So you see, we come by our use of the word in a perfectly natural way. An interesting fact, and one that goes to prove that minds work in accustomed channels, is to be noted in the circumstance that the mysterious phenomena of mesmerism, etc., noticed in Europe and America during the past century or so, came to be naturally called animal magnetism, personal magnetism, etc., the mind of the public intuitively connecting the phenomena with that of the magnet, which it very much resembles. And, in our day, we speak of people being very magnetic, lacking magnetism, having a magnetic presence, etc., etc. And so history repeats itself. The magnet, which was originally called the Magian or magic stone because its force resembled the mentative attraction manifested by the Magi or Magians, serves to give a name to similar manifestation of mental force centuries after. The magnet gives back to the 20th century Magians the name it borrowed from the Magians of ancient Persia. It has repaid the debt. While the phase of mind power which has to do with the operation of the force upon distant minds and objects is perhaps the most startling, still that phase which is called personal magnetism is one of the most important and remarkable. Its very frequent occurrence often causes us to overlook it, but it is the phase which is effectively used by those who understand it, and the one against which it behoves us to guard ourselves. All have noticed that some individuals seem to have a winning way about them, and are able to induce others to fall into their way of thinking, and to do what they wish done. The so-called magnetic man is able to sway audiences or individuals by his mystic power, and one often fails to realize just how it was done when he recalls the words spoken, or reads them in cold type the morning after. The secret lies not alone in what is said, or even in how it is said, but rather in how great a degree personal magnetism was emanated by the speaker. Many persons who have dealings with the public in the direction of selling goods, securing subscriptions, selling life insurance, etc., etc., have acquired a degree of the art of using personal magnetism, often being unconscious of the force they are employing. And many large employers of agents have schools wherein the agents are taught the psychology of suggestion, personal influence, etc., and more or less of personal magnetism, although under some other name. And, more than this, every person who is in earnest, when talking to another person, manifests more or less personal magnetism, unconsciously, or consciously. While the statement may bring down upon my head the wrath of those who believe that the phenomena of the old-fashioned revival are due to the workings of the Spirit, I do not hesitate to affirm that all students of psychology know that the greater part of the fervor is due to emotional excitement produced by personal magnetism, manifesting along both the lines of mentative currents and suggestion. Anyone who has ever attended a Negro revival or camp meeting has carried away with him a memory of the effects of a certain kind of personal magnetism upon a certain type of emotional minds. And not alone in the field of emotional religion does this force manifest itself so strongly, it is just as plainly demonstrated in the case of emotional politics. Let any man sit down and sanely consider the performances of the average man of the rank and file of either of the political parties during a campaign. See how men are swayed by emotional appeals to their prejudices and party spirit. See how they allow themselves to be blinded by glittering promises and statements, without a shred of reasonable argument, until they become fanatics. Their emotions are skillfully played upon by the leaders and speakers, and the current of personal magnetism and suggestion spreads over the body of the party until they become a mob possessed of certain fixed ideas that have taken possession of them. Families are split by factional differences, and hatred reigns when love formerly had its abode. The excitement grows fiercer and fiercer, until at last the day of the election is at hand, and the country goes into a paroxysm of emotional excitement. Then the result is announced. The next day everyone suffers from a relapse, and the country begins to laugh over what has happened. After the sting of defeat has worn off, and the elation of victory has melted away, it is found that the country is moving along about as usual, not going to the dogs because some man is defeated, nor taking great leaps forward because some other man has been elected town supervisor, or president, as the case may be. The people play their parts year after year, that is, the majority of them being swayed by emotional excitement rather than by reason, thought, or intelligence. And the men who pull the mental strings grin to themselves as they think over what fools these mortals be, and prepare themselves to pull the same strings again upon the next occasion, and to make their sheep-like followers again dance to the tune of my party, right or wrong, my party. And in both revival and political campaign the moving spirit is the same. Our old friend, personal magnetism, operates through the force of a few feelings conveyed from the minds of the few to the minds of the many, aided and abetted in its subtle influence by its mate, mental suggestion. Gaining force under the force of the desire and will of each person who adds his force to the original impulse, it swells in volume until, like the rolling snowballs, it grows to mammoth proportions and sweeps all before it. You have often heard that enthusiasm is infectious. Did you ever wonder why? Have you ever wondered why you enjoyed a theatrical performance more when the house was filled than when only half its seating capacity was used? Have you ever understood the cause of the wave of enthusiasm that has swept over the large audience, including yourself, until you felt all in a mental glow? Have you ever realized that what is known as the psychology of the crowd, by which term is meant the influence that can be gained over a crowd, whereas the separate individuals composing the crowd could not be so affected, is due to personal magnetism and mental suggestion, which is started into operation and then spread from mind to mind by the added desire and will manifested in mental states and their associated physical actions. And there is another fact to be remembered while we are considering audiences and crowds. I allude to the fact that the speaker is affected by the personal magnetism of the audience, which flows back upon him, giving him increased power to send again to them his own ideas, awakening fresh emotional excitement in them. It is action and reaction always. It is of the greatest importance that one understands the causes of these mental epidemics, for when the cause is once understood, one is far less liable to be carried away by emotional excitement spread in this way. Many sober, sensible people have been swept off their feet by these waves of personal magnetism, and have done and said things that would otherwise have been impossible for them. They have allowed the personal magnetism to reach their minds through the emotive pole, arousing ideas and desires that otherwise would have been impossible. We have seen, or heard, of respectable citizens, including the members of the so-called learned professions, lawyers, doctors, teachers, preachers, joining in mobs and allowing themselves to be carried away by the personal magnetism and suggestion of the more excitable members thereof, and participating in acts that afterwards seemed like horrible nightmares to them. The emotional nature is always very near the surface, in the majority of men, and it should be ever guarded from outside arousing influences. The motive pole of the mind, the willpower, should ever be on guard to resist this invasion of the emotive pole, desire force. And so should the will ever be on guard to neutralize the personal magnetism of others who in personal interviews seek to bend the minds of their hearers to their ideas, and by thus arousing desire mold them so as to work their wills upon them. In all of these cases of personal magnetism, and mental suggestion, whether along the lines of personal influencing, appeals, artful suggestion, etc., as well as in the cases of mental epidemic, the effect is produced by the mentator, or suggester, obtaining the voluntary attention of the other or others, and thus holding his will engaged, and his emotive pole of mind thus unguarded, while he pours in his mentative currents, or suggestions, usually both, into the emotive pole of his hearers. He thus induces in them the desires, emotions, and feelings which act as motive forces, causing them to act according to his wishes and will. The person affected is rendered unable to reason correctly, or intelligently, for his will is on a vacation, and his reason is swayed by his desires, emotions, and feelings thus induced, the necessary support of the will being lacking. The will of the man sending the mentative currents, or mental suggestions, is in control, instead of the wills of the hearers and persons influenced. In the cases of widespread mental contagion, the influence spreads from mind to mind, along the same lines, and according to the same laws. I trust that what I have said along these lines will appeal to the student in the direction of causing him to interpose a resistance to these currents and suggestions in cases such as I have mentioned. The remedy is in his own hands, simply the interposition of the will, in the manner of which I shall speak as we proceed. Surround yourself with an armor of willpower which will act as a shield against influences of this sort, and which will beat them back upon their senders. If people but understood this law, they would cause these selfish mentative currents to be reflected back upon the sender until he was swept away in the whirlwind of his own raising. It is apparent to all students of human nature that there is a wonderful difference in the degrees of what is called personal force observable in different persons with whom we come in contact. Some are very forceful, and others are quite forceless, and others form varying degrees between these two extremes. This difference in personal force depends upon the degree of dynamic positivity or negativity in the magnetism of each person. The man who is able to manifest a strong degree of mind power along the lines of motive polarity, or willpower, becomes dynamically positive. I use the word positive in this connection in the sense of Webster's definition, having the power to direct action or influence. Passing down the scale, through varying and lessening degrees of positivity, we reach the case of the man who is almost devoid of this power of manifesting mind power, and his condition we call that of dynamic negativity. By negative, as I use it here, I mean non-positive, lacking the power of direct action or influence. Now, every person has his own degree of dynamic positivity. Each one is dynamically positive to some others, and dynamically negative to others still, unless indeed one has reached the limit of positivity or negativity, which limit cannot be definitely fixed. Two persons meet each other. At once there ensues a silent, quiet struggle between their dynamic mentation, depending for its intensity upon the importance of the meeting. Still, in any and all events, the struggle ensues, usually unconsciously. It may be over in a moment, or it may last a long time, but from that struggle, sooner or later, one or the other must emerge a victor, unless, as is rarely the case, they are of equal degrees of positivity. And there is no mistake about the result. Each one recognizes himself as the victor, or the defeated, and adjusts himself to his relative position. I do not mean by this that the degree of dynamic positivity is fixed permanently in either person. For the contrary is the case. One of the persons who is really stronger, usually, may be weaker at that particular time owing to his will being fatigued, or by reason of his having relaxed his willpower, as is often the case. And in such a case, the defeated one may be the victor at the next encounter, or may even rally his energies in a moment later and turn the tables. One may have a strong will, in moments of activity, and yet in moments of passivity he may relax it very much. And, a still more important fact, one may so increase his willpower that he will be able to completely dominate those who formerly overmastered and even overawed him. All of us know of instances of this kind in our own personal experiences. At the extreme dynamic positive pole are to be found those wonderfully forceful men who seem to dominate all with whom they come in contact. These people fairly paralyze the wills of those around them, and induce emotive states almost at will. When in deep, earnest, meditative effort, they seem to actually plunge their will into the mind of the other persons, and set themselves up as the dominant force therein, taking the others' wills captive and holding them obedient to the master will of the positive man. Such men are of course rare, and whenever they exist they make a strong mark on the history of their times, local or general. I do not like to quote Napoleon Bonaparte as an example, for he has been used to illustrate almost everything. But still, the mind intuitively flies to him in thinking of the dominant will. Napoleon had a marvelous will, an almost superhuman will. It was manifested not only on the world at large, but also upon those closest to him in the way of personal contact. This man worked his will on those around him, and forced his desires upon them, also. He dominated everything and everybody, and his contemporaries, even his enemies, testified to this marvelous personal power. He is a very good example of this extreme positive type. Passing down the scale, we see men of strong personal force in all walks of life. These men formerly played the part of warriors or rulers of kingdoms, but the increasing importance of commercial life in the world's affairs has developed and brought forth a new type of these positive men, who now show themselves as captains of industry, prominent figures in frenzied finance, makers and rulers of the great trusts of this country, and others. A little lower in the scale of personal force we find men of marked power, but still a little less strong than those above them. And so we pass down, through the varying degrees of the scale, meeting the average man and woman, and then on to the weaklings of the race. At the extreme negative end of the scale we find those impressionable creatures, known to students of experimental psychology as somnambules, or impressionables, who have merely to be told to do a thing, in an authoritative manner, in order to have them attempt to do it, or at least to feel impelled to do so. There are many people upon whom the phenomena of extreme mental suggestion may be produced while they are wide awake. They will feel the burn on their hands, caused by your finger, if you but suggest it to them in the right way. They will be unable to draw apart their hands, which have been fastened together by your strong suggestion. They will be drawn backward, or forward, by your suggestion. There are many people of this kind, some more impressionable than others, but all quite impressionable, who will be driven this way or that way by those who understand the subject. Fortunately, this fact is not generally recognized, or else we should hear of still more cases of strange influence, etc., in the newspapers. But the subject is becoming more widely discussed and known now, and it is only a question of time when the law will be compelled to take cognizance of it. Fortunately, however, the extreme negative condition may be overcome by one, by developing his will and learning the principles underlying the subject. Knowledge of the nature of the subject robs the force of much of its effect, the latter depending largely upon the passive ignorance of the subject. Give him the proper instruction, and he will be able to interpose a resistance. Every man has his present place on the scale, but he may improve his position. Personal magnetism bears a close resemblance to that which in olden times was frequently termed mental fascination. Fascination means the act of fascinating, or state of being fascinated. The word fascinate springs from the Latin word fascinare meaning to enchant, bewitch, charm by eyes or tongue, captivate, attract, etc. The definition of the English word, fascinate, is as follows: to act upon by some powerful or irresistible influence, to influence by an irresistible charm, to allure, or excite, irresistibly or powerfully, to charm, captivate, or attract powerfully, to influence the imagination, reason, or will of another, in an uncontrollable manner, to enchant, captivate, or allure, powerfully or irresistibly. The above definition is condensed from a number of the best dictionaries, and gives the essence of the idea embodied in the word. In this work I use the term personal magnetism in the sense of the action of mind power in the direction of powerfully influencing the imagination, desire, or will of another. This is my own broad definition which includes all the varied phenomena. Chapter 10. Examples of dynamic mentation. The story of dynamic mentation runs along with the history of the human race, for it has always been known to man in some form. Coming to primitive man along with other inheritances from still lower forms, it was used from the beginning. Its earliest forms were similar to its employment by the lower animals, such as has been mentioned in a preceding chapter. The positive minds of the race influenced and dominated the more negative ones. Without understanding its laws, the positive barbarians discovered that they possessed a stronger power of inducing mental states among their negative companions, and were thus enabled to work their will upon them. Many of the leaders of barbarian races owe their positions of prominence and leadership to this law of mental induction. But along with the rise of leaders there was manifested a similar rise in power and influence of the priests. All races have had their priests, and have today. A priest is a man whose office is that of a mediator between men and their divinities, one who claims to represent the supernatural entities in their dealings with men, a religious, or spiritual middleman, as it were. I use this expression in all seriousness, and with no desire to speak lightly of the priestly offices, which have played an important part in the history of the race. The priests, not being occupied with warfare, or agriculture, and by reason of their support being contributed by the people, found plenty of time to think, a somewhat rare privilege in the early days, and even in these times, for that matter. And so, there gradually arose, among all peoples, a priestly caste that possessed the bulk of intelligence of the race. These priests soon began to recognize the importance of mind power, and they studied its underlying principles and laws of operation. This of course gave them an additional hold on the people, and a power over them. There seems to be no doubt but that even in the early days of the race, the priestly caste held a very wide knowledge of the laws and practice of dynamic mentation. In the heart of Africa today, we find the voodoo men, or conjurers, or medicine men, well versed in the application of mind power. It was also known among the early American Indians, although their degenerated descendants seem to have lost the knowledge, except in a few instances. The power of the priesthood among primitive races is based almost entirely upon some form of dynamic mentation. And, as we see the race ascending in the scale, so do we see the priests displaying a broader and fuller knowledge of the subject in question. The history of the Oriental races show that a full knowledge of the operation of mind power has been possessed by them for thousands of years. In the pictured stories of the Egyptians, the traces of which appear in their ruined temples and other buildings, we see that they understood the art perfectly. In ancient Persia and Chaldea, the art arose to great heights. In fact, among all of the advanced ancient races of men, we find an important place given to the subject before us. Among the ancient mysteries, and the various ceremonies of the temples, of the early races, we see many instances of the use of this power. Back of the rites and ceremonies were always the underlying principle and application. In the early use of the force, its employment was largely along the lines of healing. But still we read in the pages of early history of many instances of mental fascination, pure and simple. That which was afterward called mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., was well known to the ancients, and, in fact, some of the recorded results coming down to us from the past have never been equaled by modern experimenters. Some of the feats of the modern Hindu magicians, or Farkas, have never been equaled by Western hypnotists. Ancient history is full of instances of the operation of dynamic mentation among the people of the early days. It is related that Julius Caesar, while quite a young man, fell in with pirates near the Isle of Rhodes, who captured his ship, and took him prisoner. They held him for several weeks, while awaiting the ransom money being raised by his relatives. Plutarch writes that while the young Caesar was the captive of the pirates, he asserted his mastery over them to such an extent that he seemed a ruler rather than a prisoner. When he wished to rest or sleep, he forbade them to make any noise, and they obeyed him without question. He abused them and ordered them around like servants, and they did not seem able to disobey him. He did not hesitate to threaten them with death when he regained his liberty, and they did not resent it, and he afterward made good his threats. It is related of Alcibiades, the Athenian, that he once made a bet with some of the young Athenian nobles, that he would publicly box the ears of Hipponikos, a venerable and greatly respected citizen. Not only did he bet that he would do this thing, but he also claimed that he would afterward compel the old man to give him his favorite daughter in marriage. The day following, when Hipponikos came out, Alcibiades walked up to him and gave him a resounding box on the ears. The old man seemed dazed and bewildered and retired to his home. A great public outcry arose, and the young man seemed likely to fall a victim to the indignation of the citizens. But the next day Alcibiades went to the home of Hipponikos and, after making a pretense of baring his back for punishment, he managed to induce in the old man a feeling of good humor and mirth, and obtained his pardon and goodwill, the latter increasing daily thereafter until finally he grew so devoted to the young man that he offered him the hand of his daughter in marriage, which was accepted. Anyone who is acquainted with the recorded character of the Athenians will realize what a wonderful occurrence this was. It was a striking exhibition of dynamic mentation, without a question. All the great generals of history have possessed this quality. Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and the modern mystic warrior, General Gordon, all managed their men in a mysterious and wonderful manner, so that their troops worshipped them as almost gods, and went to their death willingly and joyfully. The single instance of Napoleon, when he returned from Elba, and confronted the Bourbon army drawn up to capture him, should satisfy anyone of the possession of the greatest dynamic power by this wonderful man. You remember that the troops were drawn up confronting Napoleon, their muskets leveled at his breast in obedience to the command aim. Napoleon, who was on foot, marched deliberately toward the troops, with measured tread, gazing directly into their eyes. Then the officers shouted, "Fire!" A single shot would have killed Napoleon, and would have brought to the man who fired it a fortune from the Bourbon king. But not a man obeyed the order. So completely were they under the spell of Napoleon's fascination. Instead of firing, they threw down their guns and ran joyfully toward the Corsican, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their officers fled, and Napoleon, placing himself at the head of the troops, marched on to Paris. Other troops flocked to his standard at each point where he confronted them, although they had been sent out to capture or kill him. By the time the gates of Paris were reached, he was at the head of an immense army. The fascination manifested by this man was one of the most marked instances of its possession of which we have any record. And it seems to endure to this day almost a century after his death. The very mention of his name makes one's blood tingle. All great leaders of men, statesmen, orators, and politicians have the power of dynamic mentation developed to a considerable degree. If you have ever come in contact with a man of this sort, you will always remember the impression he made upon you. Every man who knew James G. Blaine will remember his personal magnetism, of which so much was said during his lifetime. Anyone who heard the famous speech of W.M.J. Bryan, at the Chicago Convention, in which he made use of the famous expression, "Thou shalt not press upon the brow of labor the crown of thorns, thou shalt not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," needs no further proof of the reality of dynamic mentation. Bryan was almost unknown to the majority of the delegates, and no thought of nominating him was entertained by them. But his magnetism was so great that it swept the convention like a mighty tidal wave, carrying all before it, and Bryan was carried around the hall on the shoulders of the delegates, who afterward made him their nominee for president. And although defeated twice, this man still possesses a wonderful fascination over hundreds of thousands of people in this country, who would rally around his standard at any time that he would sound the call. Henry Ward Beecher, at the Great Meeting in England, manifested the same power. The whole meeting was against him, and drowned his words by hoots, yells, and other noises. But Beecher looked them straight in the eye, and gradually cowed them into subjection, and then talked to them for 2 hours, and fairly carried the meeting by storm. He was but one man facing thousands of other men hostile to him, and determined to prevent him from speaking. But the single man won, by his dynamic will. It was not alone the words, in these cases it was the mind power behind the words. Fothergill relates the following remarkable incidents in the life of Hugo, Bishop of Lincoln, which is another illustration of one phase of dynamic mentation. Perhaps no exhibition of heroism was ever more remarkable than when Hugo, Bishop of Lincoln, bearded Richard crawled a lion, in the church of Roche-d'Andilly. In pursuit of war in Normandy, Richard demanded more supplies from his barons, and the bishop refused to supply any men. The See of Lincoln was bound to military service, he admitted, but only within the 4 seas of Britain. Richard was not a man to be lightly crossed, and Hugo was summoned to Normandy. So enraged was the king with the spiritual peer that when he presented himself in Normandy to answer the charge against him, 2 friendly barons met him to urge upon him the necessity for sending a conciliatory message to the king before entering his presence. The bishop declined the advice. The king was sitting at mass when the prelate walked up to him and, despite the monarch's frown, said, "Kiss me, my lord king." The king turned away his face. Hugo shook him and repeated his request. "Thou hast not deserved it," growled the king fiercely. "I have," returned the prelate, and shook him all the harder. The king yielded, the kiss was given, and the bishop passed calmly on to take part in the service. Mere indifference to death could never have produced such a result. There was something more. As well as utterly fearless, Bishop Hugo possessed a willpower of most unusual character, of which several instances are on record. Not only did he face the king and justify his refusal to supply men in the council chamber afterwards, but he went farther, and rebuked him for infidelity to his queen. The lion was tamed for the moment. The king acknowledged nothing, but restrained his passion, observing afterwards, "If all bishops were like my Lord of Lincoln, not a prince among us could lift his head among them." Such is the story as told by Froude. Yet Richard was the last man to permit a liberty to be taken with him, as his whole history showed. Hugo was such a remarkable illustration of what high willpower can do, that another story may be related of him. King Henry Plantagenet had made Hugo Bishop of Lincoln, yet shortly afterwards, on preferring a request for a prebendal stall for a courtier, his request was refused. Hugo had already braved his wrath once, and the king, despite the episode of Thomas à Becket, was savagely angry. Henry was with his suite in Woodstock Park, and sat down on the ground pretending to be mending his glove when the bishop approached him. The king took no notice of his spiritual peer. After a brief pause, Hugo, pushing aside an earl, sat down by the king's side. Watching the royal proceedings, he remarked, "Your Highness reminds me of your cousins at Falaise." Falaise was famous for its leather work, and it was at Falaise that Duke Robert met Arlotta the tanner's daughter, the mother of William the Conqueror. This reference to his ancestry was too much for the king, who was utterly worsted in the discussion which followed. Can anyone doubt the existence of the subtle force of mind power in the instances just related? There was mind power behind the words, actions, and courage of Hugo. Without it he would have failed. Chapter 11. Dynamic Individuality. For the purpose of illustrating the personal qualities of the dynamically positive man, along the lines of personal influence, I shall proceed to describe these qualities as existing in a person whom I will call the dynamic individual. Let us consider this man as an actually existent individual, in our treatment of him. You must endeavor to imagine him in this way, that you may understand his qualities. He is a very positive man, magnetically one of the examples of a strong, forceful man of affairs, who is constantly meeting people, and having relations with them. How does such a man act, talk, look, move and conduct himself? Let us see. In the first place, let us consider his appearance. He may be tall or short, dark or fair, stout or slender, these things do not count. But, notice this, that no matter which of the characteristics just mentioned he may possess or lack, he has a certain air about him that all may recognize, once they have seen it in any one. Let us notice this air carefully, for it may give us a clue. The principal feature about this air of the dynamic individual is its suggestion of self-confidence and fearlessness. Our man seems to have a certainty of an inward power and force about him. Not the blustering, self-important air manifested by the pinchbeck imitators of our man, but a calm, contained, poised consciousness of strength and self-confidence. Our man seems to feel that there is something in him that gives him a strength and firmness unknown to the majority of people. Every such man has this inner consciousness, and I shall tell you what it is. As I said in the first chapter, there exists in nature a universal dynamic mental principle. In this principle each individual is a center of power. This dynamic principle in its outward manifestations of one pole of its energy, at least, resembles a universal will. That is, while its inner nature cannot be known, yet in the outer aspect of one of its poles of energy it resembles a universal will in operation everywhere. And, so, we are justified in thinking of it as universal willpower. The more positive a man becomes, in dynamic mentation, the closer does he become in contact with this universal will. And the closer he is to this universal will, the more positive does he become. It is a case of action and reaction. To him that shall be given applies in this case. The quality of dynamic positivity draws one to the universal will, and the nearness to this will renders one more and more positive. But there is this to be noted in connection with this truth. When a man feels the sense of power that comes from a mental relation with the universal will, and allows the energy to flow through him, and to manifest in his acts, he has a reservoir of willpower back of him which is inexhaustible and never failing. But if, in his conceit arising from some successful action, he begins to think that the power is due to some personal strength, then he becomes conceited and the pride of personality grows upon him. This is where he makes his mistake. By this personal view of the matter he fences himself off from the universal will and limits his force to that portion which is locked up within his own mind, induced there by the will of the universe. Such a one separates himself from the source of power and puts up a barrier between himself and the universal supply. This is in accordance with the inner teachings of the great schools of occultism, and which teachings agree perfectly with the latest theories of modern science. There is a great ocean of universal will, in which we are but centers of activity, and if we will but open ourselves to the power and will contained therein, we will have an unfailing store of power upon which to draw. Let us pause for a moment and see what forces are combined in this active mentative center. In the first place we see that the dual aspect of the mind power manifests itself always. That which we have called the desire force, and that which we have called the will power, appear as the two mentative poles. You know this well, for you have studied the previous chapters wherein this point is brought out and illustrated. But here is an aspect of the matter that I did not bring out in those chapters. I allude to the resemblance of the two phases of mind power, i.e., desire force and will power, to the physical phenomena of magnetism and electricity respectively. Desire force, like magnetism, manifests in a drawing, pulling, attracting power, while will power, like electricity, manifests in a pushing, compelling, driving power. Desire force, like magnetism, tends to draw things inward unto itself, while will power, like electricity, tends to drive things outward and away from itself. This dual manifestation of energy is seen all through nature in all of its manifold forms and conditions. There is ever the drawing into a center, and there is ever the pushing outward from the center. And this law manifests upon the mental plane as well as upon the physical plane. We have heard much of people being magnetic, that is, having the power to attract persons to them, but that is merely one phase of the operation of dynamic mentation. We do not hear so much about people being electric, and yet the term is just as proper and applicable as the term magnetic. Electric people are the people in whom willpower is strongly developed and manifest. These people get after others and make them do things. They are the active, energetic, forceful men and women who get behind things and push them along. All great leaders possess this phase of energy to a marked degree. The mere mention of the matter to you will cause you to think of instances of people who possess mentative electricity. There are men who are able to make the crowd around them do their bidding. They are able to work their will upon the mass of people. These men are seen to possess a strange power, but very few understand it. It is entirely different from the fascinating, alluring, charming, attractive personality of the magnetic man, for it forces and compels by sheer force of character and will, instead of drawing and attracting. You will see why I have spoken of these two phases as masculine and feminine respectively when you consider their different manner of manifestation. But, while both of these forms of power, the magnetic and the electric, have their strong points and advantages, I hold that the highly developed individual must have both of these phases developed highly. In short, instead of being merely very magnetic, on the one hand, or very electric, on the other hand, the ideal man must be electromagnetic. In other words, he must have both sides of his mentative energy highly developed and in full operation. In this way he is able to manifest a combined influence which will make him a very giant of dynamic mentation, a dynamic individual. I would advise all who wish to become dynamic individuals to cultivate the mental image of the universal will. Think of it as a great ocean of willpower, in which you live, and move, and have your being. Feel yourself in touch with it. Think about your relation to it, constantly, and you will find that your mind will gradually open out to admit of the inflow of its power. And when you learn to know the real source of power, then you will no longer deceive yourself and attempt to shut off the flow of the universal will by erecting petty personal barriers of conceit. This inner consciousness of the dynamic individual, especially if he understands its true nature, will react on a man's personal manner and appearance and cause to manifest in him that calm, serene, positive air of power, will and strength, that the great leaders of men always possess. And that air is in itself a mighty suggestion to others, for the world has learned to associate it with power and ability. Just as the feeling manifests itself in action, so will the outward action tend to induce the inward feeling, as I have told you. If you will endeavor to imitate and reproduce the outward carriage, manner, air and demeanor of this dynamic individual, you will have taken a step toward inducing a corresponding mental state in yourself. But do not remain satisfied with this, go right to the fountainhead and receive your power direct from the universal will. But there is something else about the dynamic individual which is different from willpower. The will is a cold, keen, powerful force, devoid of color. It is like a great natural force devoid of feeling or emotion, although acting in response thereto. What other great force is manifesting strongly in our dynamic individual? Desire force? Yes, that is the other great force within him, desire force. No matter how strong a will a man may have, even though he gets in the closest touch with the universal will, he will accomplish nothing unless he be possessed of a developed desire. One must want to do things, before he wills to do them. Let us see what this desire force is. The universal mind power seems to be a strong something, containing within it all the force and energy there is in existence. It does not seem to have the attributes of personality about it, except when it becomes manifested in personal minds, or centers of power. When a personal center, or personal mind, is established in the universal, then there seems to spring into manifestation a creative desire, which constantly urges toward outward expression. This desire force is seen all through nature, in all of her forms, and is inherent in all that we call life energy, that is, the energy which prompts the building up of form and shape. This desire force causes the seed to sprout and the plant to grow, the cell to multiply, and the higher forms to evolve from the lower. It is the essence of the great creative life energy ever manifest in nature. It is essentially a feminine principle, and is constantly desiring to give birth, bring forth, create. It stirs the will into action, and never is satisfied unless it is performing creative work, mental or physical. Now, there are persons who seem to possess but very little of this desire force, except on the physical plane. Their mental plane manifests very little of this force, and consequently they accomplish little or nothing of the world's work, and merely carry out the desires of others. But there are others who have this force manifested most strongly within them. They are possessed of a craving, longing, desiring force that impels them to do things. That is, it fills them with ardent desires, along mentative lines of creation, which are ever crying out for satisfaction. The strong men and women of the world have this desire force highly developed, and its effort toward expression is what causes these people to accomplish things. Now do not mistake me. This desire is not always in the direction of owning things, but rather in the direction of doing things. It is true that when one's desires are along the line of accumulation, the force will be bent in that direction, but it may be less along these lines, and in that case the accumulation will be a mere incident of the doing. Our dynamic individual has a great deal of desire force within him. He wants to do certain things, and he wants to do them very much. He wishes to accomplish certain ends, and the desire becomes an ardent, glowing force that stirs up the desires in those around him, and at the same time incites his own will into action. His desire force combines with his will, and wonderful things are accomplished. When you come into contact with a man of intense desire, you can fairly feel the force emanating from him. Our dynamic individual has learned to concentrate his desire force. When he wants some particular thing, he forgets about the minor things, and focuses his desire upon the particular thing craved by him, and thus draws it toward him with intense energy. The will drives, forces, impels and compels. With a push, the desire force draws, induces, pulls toward one, with an irresistible pull. When our dynamic individual meets you, and wants you to do something, you can feel the pull of his desire force, drawing, coaxing, inducing, alluring, and attracting you toward him and his objects. One who wishes to do things should keep the flame of his desire burning bright. He should continually pour upon it the oil of suggestion, and place before it the lantern slides of the mental images of the thing desired. If you will study the man of strong desire, you will see that he draws everything toward him that he wants. He has a pull upon things and leaves nothing undone in the direction of his want. He is hungry and thirsty with desire, and he seeks satisfaction wherever it may be found, his wits being sharpened by the intensity of the desire. And he draws people to him by the very strength of his desire force. You will find that people will instinctively fall in with the suggestions and urgings of the strong desire man. People, as a rule, are drawn rather than pushed or forced into a thing. The seductive, drawing, charming, fascinating force of men is that of desire force, not of willpower. Yes, again I say to you that he who would succeed must, of necessity, keep his fire of desire burning bright and fierce, else it will not awaken into action his own will, nor stir the desire in others. We talk much about willpower, and its possession, but the majority of men fail because they do not desire things hard enough. They must want things the worst way, and then they will bend everything toward getting them. This is true in the case of both good and evil desires. The law is the same in both cases, and operates along the same line. We are acquainted with the disastrous consequences attendant upon the possession of evil desires, and have seen many instances of the harm wrought upon others by reason thereof. But did you ever stop to think that the same degree and intensity of desire, turned in the right direction, would accomplish wonders of good works? If you will put into your plans of proper attainment and aspiration the same degree of energy that the evil man puts into his schemes of selfish gratification, you will be able to move mountains of difficulties. This desire force in the dynamic individual is that which causes us to feel that he wants this thing, and is going to have it. You know the feeling, if you have come into contact with strong men. And they draw their own to them by the exercise of this elementary force of nature. They learn that by mentally drawing to themselves a supply of the universal energy they are enabled to transform it into desire force, as well as willpower. The emotive pole is charged, as well as the motive pole. Both draw from the same source, and both have a constant source of supply. And both may manifest a wonderful degree of this transformed energy, in the shape of willpower and desire force. In our dynamic individual, both poles are fully charged, and in active operation. Now I have said enough about the theory of the dynamic individual. I shall ask you to read over what I have said above several times, in fact reread it until you thoroughly understand it. And then I shall take you on to the practical work and exercises calculated to develop in you the qualities of that individual. Taking it for granted that you have carefully considered what I have just said, I shall ask you to perform the following exercises, etc. Exercise I. In order to realize the reality of the statement that you are a center of mind power, you must first enter into a realization of the existence of a great ocean of mind power itself. Do not pass over this lightly, for it is most important. You must begin to create a mental picture of the universe as a great ocean of living mind power, vibrating with life and force and power. Endeavor to make this mental picture so clear that you can see it with your mind's eye, and until it becomes a reality to you. Picture yourself as alone in the universe and surrounded on all sides with a vibrating, pulsating sea of energy, or power. See that power is locked up in that ocean, and that the ocean exists everywhere. Shut out from your mental field all other persons, things, or conditions. Imagine yourself as alone in the great ocean of power. You must practice frequently upon this mental picture until you are able to visualize it distinctly. This does not mean that you have to actually see it, just as you do this printed page, but that you should be able to actually feel it. You will begin to understand just what I mean after you have practiced this a little. This great ocean of mind power must become real to you, and you must practice until it does so become. The importance of the above exercise may be understood when I tell you that it will be impossible for you to manifest more than a moderate degree of power until you are able to realize yourself as a real center. And it will be impossible for you to realize yourself as such a center until you realize the existence of the ocean of power itself. For how can you think of yourself as a center of power, in an ocean of power, until you realize the existence of the ocean itself? The universal ocean of mind power contains within itself all the mind power, force, and energy that there is. It is the source from which all forms of energy arise. It is filled with an infinite number of tiny centers of energy, of which you are one. And in the degree that you draw upon it for strength, so will you receive strength. By all means endeavor to clearly visualize this great mind power ocean, for it is the source of all the force with which you are filled and which you hope to acquire. Enter into this great realization, friends, for it is the first step to power. Exercise 2. The second exercise, which will tend to increase your vibration as a center of power, is as follows: picture yourself clearly as a center of power in the mentative ocean. While seeing the ocean on all sides of you, you must see yourself as the center of it. Do not be frightened at this idea, for it is based on the truth. The highest occult teaching informs us that the great mentative ocean has its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere. That is, that being infinite in space, there is no finite spot that is really its center, and yet, on the other hand, every point of activity may be called its center. Being extended in every direction infinitely, its circumference is non-existent. Therefore you are most certainly justified in considering yourself as a center of the ocean of mind power. Each dynamic individual is such a center, and each has his world circling and revolving around him. Some have a small world, and some have mighty ones. There are centers so mighty and exalted that the human mind cannot grasp their importance. But even the tiniest point of activity is a center in itself. So hesitate not, but begin to form a mental picture of yourself as a center of power. Practice this exercise until you can clearly feel yourself as a center of power. You must learn to think of yourself as a focal point of force in the great ocean of mind power. Just as the great body of electricity manifests itself in tiny points of activity, so does mind power express itself in you who are a point of activity within itself. In urging you to perfect yourself in this realization, I would impress upon you the fact, known to all advanced occultists, that in the measure of your realization of this mighty quality of the ego will be the measure of the power possessed by you. All of the strong men of our times, and of all ages, have had this realization, intuitively or instinctively, that is, although they may not have known the philosophy or science of the matter, they have felt this sense of the power of the ego in themselves, which gave them the confidence to do things and the willpower and desire force to carry out their undertakings. It is this feeling of inherent strength that makes men strong and successful and positive. And this feeling and realization may be developed and unfolded within anyone, providing he wants it sufficiently. By the exercise of your desire and will you may build up this realization of power, and in the building up there will come to you a constantly increasing stream of desire and will. In the measure of your expression will be the measure of your impression from the source of all positive impression. Exercise 3. The third exercise consists in the realization of the nature of the power. This force, energy, or power with which you are being filled, and which you are now attracting toward your center, consists of the electrical manifestation of willpower and the magnetic manifestation of desire force. These two constitute the dual phases of the one force, mind power. And, therefore, you must begin to realize that these qualities are within you in order that you may be able to express them, and thus gain the additional and increased power that comes to those who do express them. You must begin to realize that you have a will which is capable of impressing itself on the things, persons, and circumstances of your world, and you must begin to realize that you have a desire which attracts to you the things, people, and circumstances of your world, and which, in fact, draws to you the very material from which your world is made. When you realize this dual force within you, it will begin to express itself automatically. The act of realization causes the mental machinery to begin to work smoothly and effectively. Therefore, picture to yourself this dual force within you. See yourself as influencing and acting upon the world around you. See yourself as a power in the land. And also see yourself as an attracting force, drawing to you that which you need and want and require, consciously and unconsciously. Picture yourself as a dynamic individual. You are an individual because you are a center of power. You are dynamic because you possess the electric will and the magnetic desire, the twin poles of mind power. Carry with you this thought constantly and repeat it often to yourself, and you will find it a source of power. You will find the power pouring into you when you say or think it. When you feel weak, or when you feel the need of additional power, use this statement of power. I am dynamic. And when you say it, or think it, you must picture to yourself just what you mean by the statement, hence the importance of knowing just what is meant. Do not pass over this statement of power as unimportant, but try it in actual practice and you will realize what a battery of power you have become. Those around you will soon become aware of a new sense of power within you. Keep this statement of power to yourself. Do not invite the ridicule of those around you by telling them the source of your power. Do not bother about them. If they are individuals themselves, they will understand without being told, and if they are not, all the telling in the world would not make it clear to them. Hoe your own row and mind your own business, and let them do the same. No one can build up his individuality except from within. And each must work out his own salvation and climb the ladder of attainment for himself. And the sooner that people learn this, the better will it be for all. Don't be a leaner, or a leaning post. Don't lean on anyone else, and don't let anyone lean on you. There has been too much of this foolish business about living other people's lives for them, or letting other people live your life for you. Each man or woman must grow into an individual by his or her own work and life. There is no such thing as vicarious individuality. Don't be afraid to assert the I, to claim your rightful heritage and birthright to be an individual, and not a parasite. And don't be afraid to shake off and trim off the parasitic persons that have encumbered your own unfoldment toward individuality. Let the parasites take root in the earth, just as you have done. Let them fasten their roots in the great body of strength and power instead of in the mental body of someone else. Let them stop their second-hand nourishment and learn to draw from the first source. This is the only way, and the lack of the knowledge of it is filling the world with weaklings instead of with individuals. Therefore think of these things, hold them well in mind when you make your statement of power. I am dynamic. Point 1. In considering the qualities that go to make up the person in whom dynamic mentation is likely to be strongly developed, I may mention the following. 1. Physical well-being. For there is a certain strength about a man or woman in strong, robust health, that must be taken into consideration. It is true that some persons not physically well, but unhealthy, have exercised strong powers, but this was in spite of their lack of physical health, and owing to a strong will which allowed them to master even this obstacle. But, all else being equal, there is a power about a strong, healthy, vigorous person that makes itself felt. 2. Belief in oneself, for without this no one manifests positivity. Believe in your own power and ability, and you impress others with the same belief. Confidence is contagious. Cultivate the I can and I will. 3. Poise, for the calm, well-poised, imperturbable man has an enormous advantage over one lacking these qualities. The man who meets any emergency without losing his head has something about him that makes him looked up to as a natural leader. He has one of the qualities of positivity. Cultivate the calm, masterful mood. 4. Fearlessness, for fear is the most negative emotion in the being of man. Fearlessness is a most positive quality, just as fear is the most negative. Cultivate the I dare, I do. 5. Concentration, for this one-pointedness focuses the willpower upon the object. Do one thing at a time, and do it with all the power that there is in you. 6. Fixity of purpose, for you must learn to know what you want to do, and then stick to it until it is done. Cultivate the bulldog quality. It is needed. To those who recognize the need of the above-mentioned qualities, but who lack them, I would recommend the careful study and determined application of the principles stated in the chapters of this book, entitled Mental Architecture, Making Over Oneself and Mind Building, respectively. Chapter 12. Mental Atmosphere. Our dynamic individual places himself in a receptive attitude only toward the great universal will, and in a positive attitude toward all else. In this way he really becomes a most active center of power, which becomes manifest to all with whom he comes in contact. He may not realize just what he is doing, and may know nothing of the truth herein stated, but, still he feels that he is in touch with something that aids and assists him and which gives him strength and dynamic force. He may talk about his luck, or his lucky star, or he may secretly believe himself specially favored by Providence. This is a secret belief of the majority of successful men, but the fact remains that every positive and successful man feels, underneath it all, that he has something back of him. And this belief takes form in action and causes him to manifest that air of calm, positive power and self-confidence noticeable in such men in every instance. You will readily see, from what has been said, that the personal atmospheres of persons depend upon the character of their mental states, and are the result of the mental currents emanating from them. Every person has his or her own mentative aura, or body of radiant mentative energy, which flows from them in all directions. These mentative atmospheres affect the people with whom one comes in contact. You know people who seem to carry with them an atmosphere of feeling which affects a room full of people, or even a building. This atmosphere may be positive or negative in its effect, that is, stimulating or depressing. All of these things arise in the way which I have mentioned. It is related of Rachel, the great French actress, that although she was not beautiful in form or face, still she had that indescribable charm of personality about her that caused everyone to consider her a beautiful woman, so great was her fascinating charm. That which so many call personal magnetism, as distinguished from personal force, consists of this mentative atmosphere, or radiant mentative energy, which induces in all within its field a feeling of similar emotion or vibration. The charm of the fascinating person is accounted for in the same way. It is all a matter of the mentative currents inducing feeling in others. The power called fascination, which has been known in all times and countries, arises from the same cause. It operates by the strong mentative currents pouring from one's mind and inducing mental states in others. The mentative force emanating from each individual creates a mental atmosphere around him which often extends a considerable distance from his body, especially in the case of strong individuals, whose mental atmosphere is felt when they enter a room or public place. Persons whose personality is weaker have a mental atmosphere extending only a few inches from their bodies, and which is scarcely perceptible to those coming in contact with them. The man who feels himself to be a dynamic individual carries with him an aura of mental atmosphere of positive strength, which is plainly felt by those coming in contact with him. People say about such a man that he has something about him which impresses them, but which they fail to understand. It will be worth your while to study this mental atmosphere of some strong man with whom you come in contact, for now that you have the secret of the matter you may take some valuable lessons from him. I cannot very well describe this air to you, for unless you have met a man of this kind you will not understand it. But it is a very different thing from the pompous, self-sufficient, self-important, fussy air and demeanor manifested by the cheap imitators of these great men. The dynamic individual does not tell you how great, or smart, or important he is. He leaves that for his cheap imitators. He makes you feel his strength by his very manner and atmosphere, without saying a word. He has that something about him that people notice and wonder at. And that something comes from his conscious or unconscious relation to the universal will. The little fellow who thinks he is one of the big ones believes that his strength comes from his personality, and sooner or later he stumbles because of this error. But the real big ones of life know better. They may not understand it all, but some way they feel that there is a something back of them from which they are able to draw strength and power, and believing this, they are filled with courage and daring and radiate their power on all sides. They may talk of their lucky star or special providence, or else believe themselves to be specially favored of God, as is the case with at least one of the big men of modern finance. But no matter what may be their special interpretations of this something, they all recognize its existence and trust to it. And this conviction and realization gives to the strong individuals that air of calm, positive power and self-confidence that impresses those with whom they come in contact and which forms their mental atmosphere. And in giving you instructions in the art of building for yourselves a positive mental atmosphere, I can do no better than to refer you back to first principles and again bid you to realize that you are a dynamic focus, a center of power in the great universal will, having the dual attribute of willpower and desire force. In short, that you are a living dynamo. If you will but get this realization firmly fixed in your mind, you will automatically create for yourself a most positive mental atmosphere that will be felt by all with whom you come in contact. So first, last and all the time build up this realization. Say to yourself, I am dynamic. Then think it out, dream it out, act it out. And, of course, always realize what all this means. You are the channel through which is pouring the universal willpower, and in the degree that you allow the current to so flow through you, so will be the power you are able to manifest. When you wish to manifest a special degree of power, just let this statement, I am dynamic, flame out in vivid letters in your mind. When you feel that you are being approached by some other person of strong will, whom you do not wish to influence you, just bring this statement into effect, and you will actually see the effect of it upon the other person. He will feel your strong mental atmosphere and will cease trying to affect you. And even when there is no special need for making the statement of power, it will be well for you to keep it burning bright within you, for by so doing you strengthen your realization, and your mental atmosphere reflects the inner mental state. So much for the general mental atmosphere. As we proceed, we shall see that the dynamic individual creates special mental atmosphere around him by his mental states, depending upon his will or desire at the time. Not only does his will and desire affect other persons directly by means of mental currents, but mentative induction is also set up by the mental atmosphere, without any special effort on his part. In this place, I wish to call your attention to the importance of always maintaining your positivity as a means of mental training. Do not allow yourself to become negative to others, even where there is nothing lost by so doing, for by this neglect you create a negative habit which will cause you trouble to overcome later. If a person comes into your presence and his personality seems likely to dominate or overpower yours, by all means interpose a mental resistance right then and there. It is not necessary for you to manifest the same in words, for that would make you ridiculous in many cases, nor is it necessary for you to give any special physical expression to your mental state. Simply look the person in the eye, carelessly and without any special effort, at the same time making the mental statement, I am dynamic. Point 1. And you will find that your positivity will rise until it is equal with his, and your feeling of negativity will disappear. In exceptional cases you may add mentally, I am more dynamic than you. It will be well for you to practice the creation of special mental atmospheres in order to establish the habit and thus render it easier to avail yourself of the same on special occasions. Opportunities of all kinds will present themselves to you in everyday life. The gist of the matter is to surround yourself with a mental aura of such a nature that people will act toward you as you wish them to do. A few examples may help you to get a clearer idea of what I mean, so I herewith give you the same. I know a lady, living in Chicago, who was constantly complaining that people were always running over her on State Street, the crowded retail street of the great western metropolis. She said that they were always crowding her off the sidewalk and pushing, bumping and jostling her in a most annoying manner. She asked me for instructions as to what thought she should use to prevent individuals from so acting. I answered that I did not think it was necessary to consider the separate individuals in the case, but that she should treat the crowd as a whole, by means of a protective mental atmosphere. I then advised her to build up a mental atmosphere around this statement: people respect my rights, they will not unduly impose on me in the street, I deny the power of the crowd to impose on me. And she followed this advice, and in a short time had built up a protective mental atmosphere which acted almost magically upon the crowd, who stepped aside and gave her a full right of way on the pavement. She would simply go on her way calmly, serenely and undisturbed, and the crowd let her alone. I must add that I think that the original trouble arose from a subconscious dislike of crowds and an extreme shrinking from people, the result being that this dislike acted almost as does fear, and really attracted to her the interference of people. The new mental atmosphere dispelled the old one and gave her an additional positivity besides. In this connection, I would call your attention to that remarkable psychological fact that fear acts as an attracting force, in a negative way. If you want a thing very much, you attract it to you, and if you fear it very much, you do likewise. This apparent contradiction has bothered many students of the subject, but it seems very plain to me. I think the explanation is that in both cases a vivid mental picture is held, and the attraction results along the line of visualization, which always tends to materialize the mental image. Another case, from actual experience. Another lady, also a resident of Chicago, complained that the clerks in the great department stores would not treat her courteously, but would keep her waiting without paying her any attention, and in other ways would treat her like a human doormat. She said she would not have minded this so much if other women were treated likewise, but that while she was ignored, others would receive the greatest attention, the clerks falling over themselves to wait upon them. I told her that she had gradually built up around her a mental atmosphere of expectancy, that she had fallen into the habit of expecting such treatment, and consequently she got what she expected. I think that in the beginning she had manifested a timid, humble, meek, worm-of-the-dust state of mind when she entered the big stores, which somewhat overawed her. And then, after this drew upon her the neglect of the clerks, who seem very ready to wipe their feet on human doormats, she grew to regularly expect the shabby treatment. It was not a matter of dress, or anything of that kind, for she dressed well and, for that matter, I know women who dress poorly who never get any such treatment, for they understand the underlying mental laws too well for that. It was simply a matter of a negative mental atmosphere. I told her to brace up and create a new mental atmosphere around this general statement. The clerks like me, they like to wait on me, they give me every attention, they do this because they like me, and also because I insist upon it as my right. The charm worked in a short time, and now the good lady reports that the clerks not only treat her well but even take the trouble to call her attention to desirable selections, special bargains, and all the rest of it. The cure was perfect. I call your attention to the above statement. Please note that the first part of it operated along the lines of desire force, and the latter part along the lines of willpower. The statement of the first mentioned lady, the one who objected to street crowding, was altogether along the lines of willpower. I ask the students to study and analyze each of these cases, because by so doing they will be able to apply the principles in cases coming under their own observation, and also in their own cases. I once directed a lady who complained that she was unpopular, and that nobody loved her, etc., etc., to apply a similar method. She created a new mental atmosphere around her along the lines of the general statement: people like me, they find me attractive, they love me, and like to be in my company. After a time she reported that from a state of wallflowerdom she had become quite a favorite, and in fact was at a loss to adjust herself to the changed conditions, finding somewhat of an embarrassment of likings and lovings. This was a case of desire force pure and simple. Now do not imagine for a moment that in the above cases, and hundreds of others known to me personally, the desired result was obtained merely from repeating, parrot-like, or like a phonograph, the words of the statement. This talk of the power of mere words, and all the rest of such talk, has wearied me greatly. I have seen and heard so much of this nonsense since I have become acquainted with certain people who consider themselves in the new thought that I dislike to use the word statement or affirmation. These people have imagined that by the mere repetition of words, they could work miracles. Pshaw! What nonsense! They remind me of the Chinese, and certain other people who write long prayers on slips of paper and allow them to flutter in the breeze, hoping that the gods will accept their prayers at face value while the prayer makers are amusing themselves elsewhere. Sometimes they attach little bells to the prayers in order to attract the attention of the gods. Others paste the prayers on water wheels, turned by the streams, thereby claiming credit for a prayer at each turn of the wheel. Cheap praying that. Oh, don't laugh, some of you are just as foolish. You have been making your statements and affirmations in the same spirit, and now feel disappointed because nothing happened. Of course nothing happened, how could it be otherwise? I have said over and over again, and now say it over again another time, that the words of themselves are nothing. The real virtue lies in the feeling behind the words. If there is no feeling, there is no result. In order to get the results, you must erect the framework of words, and then build around it the structure of feeling, and expectation, and visualization. That's the way to do it. The words are merely the skeleton, the flesh and blood are the feelings and materialized visualizations. The ladies mentioned above, whom I have used as typical cases to illustrate the principle, did not rest content with words, for I wouldn't allow them to do so. I kept after them, insisting upon their using the proper mental exercises and methods. That's what did the work. And now I shall give you the same instruction and directions that I gave them. Adapt them to your own cases and you will be likewise successful. The kernel of the process of creating the mental atmosphere lies in what is called visualization. Visualization is simply the creation of a strong mental image of the thing desired, the perfecting it each day until it becomes almost as clear as an existing material thing. Then the visualization tends to materialize itself, that is, it begins to build around itself actual material conditions corresponding with the mental framework. The statement of words is the pattern around which the visualized mental images form themselves. And the mental image is the framework around which the actual material conditions form themselves. The lady above mentioned made her mental image of the street conduct of the crowd, and the people unconsciously felt it and built themselves around it. So in the case of the lady in the department store, and the others mentioned, the mental image manifested itself as a mental atmosphere, and gradually materialized. The thing to do in visualizing is to bring the positive imagination to see and feel the thing as actually existent. Then by constant practice and meditation the mental atmosphere becomes formed, and the rest is all a matter of time. See yourself as you wish to be. See others as you wish them to be. See conditions as you wish them to be. Think them out, dream them out, act them out. And materialization will follow upon visualization, even as visualization followed upon the statement. In this connection, however, I must call your attention to the fact that the degrees of receptivity of other people to your mental atmospheres and mental pictures depend entirely upon their degree of positivity. They respond only in the degree that they respond to other mentative influences. The strong avoid influences to which the weak yield, in this as in every other phase of the phenomena. But do not let that cause fear on your part. You may make yourself positive, you have had the instructions given you, and it is now your own work to do the rest. I might write a whole book on this subject of visualization in the phase of forming mental atmospheres, but I have herein given you the underlying principles, and have also given you a few illustrative examples. You must do the rest yourselves. If you have carefully read this book, and have studied between the lines as well as the lines themselves, you will have grasped the little details of the matter which will not be apparent to those who have not done so. Each will find in this book that for which he or she is ready, and not a bit more. I think the careful students among you will readily understand just what I mean by this. If you do not understand, then I cannot help you out, and you must wait until you unfold in understanding. But I would say that a rereading of this work is advisable, several rereadings, in fact. Each time that you reread it you will find something new that you had previously overlooked, and each reading will discover many hidden meanings now suddenly made plain. The man who wishes to be successful in his dealings with his fellow men must surround himself with a positive mental atmosphere. He must create an atmosphere of self-reliance and positivity that will overcome the negativity of those with whom he comes in contact. This positive mental atmosphere is that subtle influence that emanates from the strong men of affairs, and which affects, influences, and controls people to a greater degree than the flow of words which many affect, believing it to be the key of success. When you come in contact with one having a mental atmosphere of this kind you are affected by it, consciously and unconsciously. And if it has this effect on you in the case of other persons, why should you not reach out and possess this power yourself? Why should you not be a positive instead of a negative? The directions and exercises given in this chapter, coupled with the instruction given in other chapters of the book, should enable you to develop around yourself a most positive mental atmosphere that will make you a power. But it all depends upon yourself. You must exercise your will and desire, just as you would do with a muscles that you wish to develop. The rule operates in the mental as well as in the physical world. In addition to the exercises given in preceding chapters, I would suggest that the following may prove useful to some of you, in special cases, in forming the positive mental atmosphere. I shall merely give you the verbal framework, and you must build around it the mental picture, which in turn produces the mental atmosphere. But, remember, even in practicing these exercises never lose sight of the main statement of power, I am dynamic, for that statement will impart life, vitality and energy to the other mental images and statements. Here are the statements referred to, the verbal framework around which you are to build your mental picture that you wish to materialize on the objective plane. You will find them useful in many cases. Mental framework. I surround myself with an atmosphere of success. 2. I am positive. I have a strong will. I make a positive impression on those coming into my mental atmosphere. 3. I am fearless, absolutely fearless, nothing can harm me. 4. I kill out all worry and discouragement, I radiate hope, cheerfulness, and good nature. I am bright, cheerful, and happy, and make all around me feel the same way. V. I am well poised, calm, and self-controlled. 6. I have a perfect mastery over my temper, emotions, and passions, and all recognize this to be a fact. 7. I am at ease here, and all bashfulness and timidity has departed. I am calm, at ease, and feel at home. 8. People like me. I am surrounded with a mental atmosphere that causes people to like me. 9. I am master of my surroundings. Nothing disturbs me, nothing affects me adversely. I am master. X. I am surrounded with a mental atmosphere of protection. No one's adverse thoughts, currents, or suggestions can penetrate this protective armor. I am safe from mental attacks. I am safe, strong, and positive. In using any of the above statements, be sure to follow my advice and instructions regarding the mental images, etc., which put flesh on these verbal skeletons and make a living force out of the dry bones of words. Remember the importance of mental imaging and visualization in this matter of creating mental atmospheres. Chapter 13. Channels of Influence. In the last chapter, one spoke of the effect of mental atmospheres with which people surround themselves. You will notice that in my discussion of that part of the subject I spoke only of the general influence exerted upon others, and not of the direct personal influence exerted by one man upon another in personal intercourse. Let us now consider the channels of direct personal influence. As I have told you elsewhere, every time two people meet there ensues a silent mental conflict, or struggle for supremacy, from which one or the other emerges a victor, and which victory is fully recognized by both of the parties to the proceeding. This mental struggle is usually the combat between the general mental powers of the two, without regard to special mental states induced at the time. But the man who is skilled in the art of dynamic mentation goes further than this, for he recognizes that he may concentrate his mentative energy into definite shape and form, and focus the force of his mental imagery direct upon the other person, with such force and power that the second person will feel the dynamic strength exerted. This direct personal influence operates along the lines of both desire force and willpower, of course. I have explained elsewhere how the willpower may be used to awaken desire in another, and how it may also capture the will of the second person. I have also explained how desire force induces a similar desire in the second person, and also how it is often used to captivate the will of the other person. It is not necessary for me to repeat these things, you are supposed to be fully acquainted with them, from your study of this book. And so I shall proceed to a consideration of the channels of expression of personal influence, and the methods usually employed by those using it. The instruments of expression. These channels of influence may be classified as follows. 1. Suggestive channels, consisting of a. the suggestive manner, and b. the suggestive tone, and c. the suggestive word. 2. The instrument of the eye. 3. The instrument of the touch, and all of these three forms are, of course, merely the channels or instruments by which, and through which, the mind power expresses itself, the channel through which pours the mentative energy. Let us consider them in the above order. In the chapters on mental suggestion, you will find stated the active principles of that phase of the subject, with which you should thoroughly familiarize yourself. You will see there that suggestion is the outward symbol of the inward mental state, and that it is the inner state that gives vitality to the suggestion. Get this idea fixed firmly in your mind, and always think of the force behind the suggestion. I have explained to you, also, that when one receives a suggestion through a physical agent, there is induced in him the mental state corresponding to the one originating that physical suggestion. For example, if you feel yourself filled with confidence, energy, and fearlessness, your outward appearance will reflect that inner state, and the outer appearance will become a suggestion to others. These others will instinctively feel that your inner state is as I have stated. And, this being so, a physical suggestion made stronger than usual will produce a deeper impression on others than would any ordinary suggestion. In view of the above, you will see why it is that those familiar with the subject deem it important to cultivate the suggestive channel instruments. Beginning with A. The suggestive manner, you will see why it is that we are impressed with the manner of a man who manifests energy, self-confidence, and power in every motion. And also, why we have confidence in a man whose manner indicates that he is a person used to being trusted by others, accustomed to having confidence reposed in him. And so I might mention hundreds of examples tending to show that if a man's manner conveys the impression that he is used to being treated in a certain way, and that he is accustomed to acting in a certain way, we are very apt to accept the suggestion of manner, and fall into line with the rest of people. And if the man happens to be a good actor, we may be imposed upon and fooled by his suggestive manner. Not only does this law hold good in the case of the manner and appearance of success, strength, confidence, etc., but it also operates along the lines of the appearance and manner of failure, weakness, and distrust. Do you not know of cases wherein you have felt that certain persons were not worthy of confidence, or were not to be depended upon where strength of character was required, or were not likely to succeed? Of course you have, and you acted upon the suggestion, too. In illustrating this point, I have frequently used the illustration of the two dogs, the one carrying himself in a manner betokening self-respect and an ability to prevent and resent undue liberties, and the other carrying his tail between his legs, in a manner and appearance indicating that he expected to be kicked and cuffed. The first dog is almost invariably treated with respect, even by the most mischievous youngsters, while the second one almost always invites to himself the kicks, tin cans, and brickbats of the young hoodlums of the neighborhood. And this illustration is as true in the case of people as in the case of dogs. Better take the hint. But, you may say, how is one to acquire the proper suggestive manner? My answer is that there is but one sure way, and that is to begin to think out the part, visualize it, and act it out. In other words, if you wish to convey a suggestive manner of confidence, you must begin to think confidence from morning until night. And you must also begin to visualize confidence when you have the chance to do so, that is, you must make a mental picture of yourself as manifesting confidence. And you must also begin to act out the part. Now about this acting out, I would say that I mean not only the playing the part in your interviews with people, but I also mean an actual series of rehearsals. In private, just as you would perform if you were preparing to play a part on the stage, in public. You must form a mental image of how you would look and act if you were filled with confidence, and were approaching people. You will find that practice will improve you very much in this way, and that you will soon acquire a manner that will be like second nature and will really serve to give the suggestion of your manner to others with whom you come in contact. And, more than this, it will actually tend to build up confidence in yourself. Imagine yourself as approaching strange people, and then act out the part the best you know how, improving a little in ease and smoothness of action each day. Think of how the actor on the stage impresses you, and then remember that the manner was acquired by constant practice and work. And you may do the same, and may manage to impress other people just as the actor does you. And what is true in the case of confidence is true regarding any character that you wish to play. Any and all characters may be played out in this way, and an appearance and manner acquired which will give the suggestion to others. I wish I could make you realize how much there is in this method. If you could realize how some men have used it to acquire qualities that have enabled them to prey upon the public, you would realize how important it might be for you for legitimate and honorable use. In this acting out, you must remember that the practice will make you so perfect that the part will appear natural when you play it in public. But without practice, an attempt to play it in public will make one ridiculous. Remember the illustration of the real actor, and you will have the secret of acting out. And also remember this, that in the measure that you throw your mind into the part, so will be your success. When you practice, you must throw your mind into the acting, just as you would if you were in earnest. It is the mind back of it all, remember. The second suggestive channel or instrument is the suggestive tone. This, too, may be acquired by acting out. You must practice until you are able to express your meaning with feeling that all who hear may be impressed. You should begin your practice by choosing some simple words in everyday use, good morning, for instance. Try it now, and see how roughly, clumsily, and crudely you give the morning greeting. Then try to imagine that you are full of good cheer, energy, and brightness, and then throw your feeling into your good morning, and see how different it seems. Practice this a while and you will soon acquire a natural, cheery, bright, and invigorating tone when you say good morning. You will not need a teacher in elocution to tell you how to do this. Try to feel the part, and you will express it naturally. Make your feelings more flexible, and your tones will reflect them. After you have mastered the simpler terms of expression, work up to larger sentences and speeches. Try them on the chairs in your room, in imagining that people are seated therein. Speak to them feelingly and with expression until you acquire the art. You will not realize how much you may gain by such practice until you actually try it. I wish that you could hear the testimony of some people who have acquired this art. There is nothing more important in personal influence than a good suggestive tone. Think of the people whom you know, and then remember what an influence their voices have on you. Not only the quality of the voice, but the tone. You readily recognize the difference between the tone of the hesitating, timid, self-doubting person, and that of the confident, self-reliant individual. There is a subtle vibration about the tone of the latter that causes one to feel confidence and respect, and which exacts obedience in a quiet, calm way, devoid of bluster or rant. If you will but think a moment, you will see that much depends upon the tone. You will see that when you say to a person, "You can," the tone in which you say "can" goes a long way toward producing the response. And so it is with the suggestive tone, no matter what it is made to express. It always impresses upon one that the speaker using it means what he says. And that is why many public men practice year after year in mastering this instrument of influence, the suggestive tone. Again would I refer you to the example of the actor, see how he manages to throw feeling into his tone. And you may do likewise, if you will but practice in earnest, and throw your mind into the work. Think of the thing you wish to express, visualize it and then act it out in your tone. You will be surprised at the rapid progress that you will make. Remember always, though, the tone is but the instrument of expression of the mind back of it. Many people make the mistake of speaking with the muscles instead of with their nerves, as one writer has expressed it. In other words, they seem to throw muscular force into their tones, instead of nervous energy, and in so doing they make a great mistake, for the former has a dull, non-penetrating effect, whereas the latter vibrates subtly and reaches the feeling part of one's mind. Feel, 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 when you wish to speak impressively, and your tones will reflect the same, and induce a corresponding feeling in others. The voice is a mighty indicator of the mental state within. Excepting the eye, no outward form of expression of character responds so quickly and fully to the inner mental state as the voice. The voice and eye are the two principal outward avenues of expression of the mental states within, and both register the subtle changes and degrees of the inner state. If you will stop to think for a moment and consider the different voices of the people you know, you will see that in nearly every case the voice gives one a clue to the character or prevailing mental states of the speaker. Not alone the quality of the voice but the tone. Every reader knows the difference between the tones of the hesitating, timid, self-doubting person, and that of the confident, self-reliant individual. In the tone of the latter there is noticeable that peculiar something that denotes power and authority, and inspires attention, interest and respect, without need of vulgar self-assertion or blustering speech. Let us listen to the tones of our dynamic individual. First, it is under the control of his will. It is loud or soft, as he wills it to be, it never runs away from him. If the person to whom he is talking raises his voice to a strident pitch, our individual does not follow suit. On the contrary, he puts a little more force into his tone, but keeps the pitch the same, and before long, By his will, in his evenly pitched tone, he will actually force down the pitch of the other to a normal degree. I have seen many instances of this fact, and have noticed that the temper of the other person is toned down in accord with his decreasing pitch of voice. A calm, even positive tone, in which the will is apparent in self-control and in forceful effect, will master the tones of others pitched in a fiercer key, and in the mastery of the voice of the other you will often effect a mastery of his will. By making captive the outer expression you often capture the inner man. There are two very good reasons for one studying the voice of the dynamic individual, as follows. 1. Because it is by his voice that he manages to make some of the most powerful suggestions upon others, and 2. Because by the expression in his voice, or rather the inner impulse causing the vocal expression, he causes to flow out strong mentative currents which affect and influence the other person. So in its inner, and outer, aspects the cultivation of the voice is quite desirable. You will find that the dynamic individual, particularly if he is engaged in an occupation necessitating his giving orders, and directions, or advice, to others, has developed a voice resembling in many details the suggestive voice habitual to the practitioner of mental suggestive therapeutics. The reason is plain. Both the man of business affairs and force, and the suggestionist, have accustomed themselves to speaking in a forceful, firm, positive manner, and thus fairly driving home their ideas expressed in words. The man of affairs does not know just why he does this, but his tone is the outward expression of his forceful mental state. And this is likewise true of the suggestionist, although he may have deliberately cultivated the suggestive tone at the beginning of his practice. It is somewhat difficult to correctly define and explain the suggestive tone, although if one once hears it he will never forget it. But I will try my best to make it plain to you here. In the first place, the suggestive tone is fairly charged with the mental idea back of the words. Each word has an inner meaning, and the suggestive tone carries this idea with it, so that the hearer gets the full mentative benefit and influence of it. Do not imagine that this tone is theatrical, or tragic, or unnatural. It is none of these. It is a forceful, natural tone. Its expression is that of being in earnest and meaning just what you are saying. You know how you would speak if you were earnestly telling someone to do some important thing, upon which much depended. Well, that's the tone, modified of course by the particular circumstances and necessities of each case. It must be in earnest, must be more or less intense, must have focused in it the feeling behind it, in such a way as to awaken in the mind of the hearer the feeling back of the words. The voice of the dynamic individual is flexible, and adaptable to any mood or phase of feeling that he wishes to induce in his hearers. It may be positive and masterful, along the lines of suggestion by direct command, or authority. Or it may be subtle and insinuating, along the lines of suggestion by association or imitation. Or it may assume a teacher-like tone, along the lines of suggestion by repetition, in which the statement is made in a quiet, convincing way, as a teacher makes his statements to his class, the repetition of which brings conviction to the mind of the hearer. Or it may take on that peculiar caressing tone which is noticed in magnetic men of a certain type, who allure, charm, fascinate and draw to them other people by reason of their subtle power of charming. This power, which finds its expression largely in the voice, always reminds me of a female leopard or tiger, for the feline is mingled with the feminine in a peculiar way. This tone of the voice can be best described as caressing. When it is exhibited by one well versed in its use, every word seems to be a soft caress, and has a peculiar soothing effect upon the hearer, lulling his will to sleep and opening his emotive mentality to the suggestions and mentative currents of the speaker. In short, the dynamic individual, in his use of the voice, has acquired to a certain degree the art of the actor and orator. He is able to express feeling, real or assumed, by his voice, so that a corresponding mental state is set up in the minds of his hearers. And one may acquire this art. By practice a vibrant, resonant, expressive voice may be cultivated, and used, too, with the greatest effect in personal magnetism. As an instance of this, let me cite you the case of Nathan Shepherd, the well-known lecturer and authority on public speaking. Mr. Shepherd relates that when he first made up his mind to devote himself to public speaking, he was told by his tutors that he would be a perfect failure in such a profession, because, as he says, my articulation was feeble, my organs of speech were inadequate. If I would screw up my little mouth, it could be put into my mother's thimble. These facts were enough to discourage any man, but Shepherd rose above them, and determined to apply his will to the task of conquering these disadvantages, and mastering the subject of public speaking. And he succeeded marvelously. By pure willpower he, as he says, increased my voice tenfold, doubled my chest, and brought my unrhetorical organs somewhat in subjection to my will. He became one of the best public speakers of his time. So there is hope for all of you, if you will but manifest persistency and earnestness in your application of the will. The third suggestive channel is the suggestive word. I may be able to explain this more clearly when I call your attention to the fact that each word is a crystallized thought. In every word there is an imprisoned thought. And when you lodge a word in the mind of another person, the crystal covering is dissolved, and the released thought manifests itself. And, this being so, it becomes important for one to carefully choose the crystallized thoughts, or words, which he wishes to implant in the mind of another. You should study words until you are able to distinguish between those which carry a live, active, feeling thought, and those less strong. Take the word strong for instance. Does it not make you feel strength when you hear it forcibly and feelingly pronounced? Take the word kind, and see what feelings it arouses in you. Pronounce the words lion and lamb and see the different feelings you experience from the differing sounds. Take the word crash and see how it suggests the crashing, crunching, tearing, startling thing for which it stands. Compare the sound of the words rough and smooth, and you will see what I mean. The only way that I can point out to you to acquire the use of suggestive words is to study words themselves. Listen to the words used by others, and note their effect on you. Take a small dictionary and run over its pages, and you will soon have a collection of good, strong, effective terms for handy use when occasion demands. A man does not have to be highly educated in the usual sense of that term, in order to use strong, suggestive words. Some instinctively choose vital words, charged with feeling, and such make their words felt. Think over this matter. In the use of all the three suggestive instruments, or channels, remember that the object is to make others feel the mental state you are expressing. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. Chapter 14. Instruments of Expression. Next in order in our list of instruments of channels of mentative expression is the eye, that most wonderful of all the human organs, and which is as much an instrument for the expression of mind power as it is an instrument for receiving the sense impression of sight. Let us consider it in its former aspect. In the first place, the eye is one of the most potent and effective instruments of suggestion, although I have not included it in that class. The expression of the eye will induce mental conditions in others along the lines of suggestion, and those who understand and have mastered this art of using the eyes have at their disposal a wonderful instrument of suggestive influence. Those of us who have ever met a very magnetic man, or a charming and fascinating woman, have carried away with us a lively recollection of the expression of the eyes of such a person. Actors and public speakers, as well as those whose business it is to meet and impress people, often make a close study of eye expression in order to produce a heightened effect along these lines. And what kind of an eye has our dynamic individual? Need you ask this question? What would you expect? Of all the physical avenues of expression of the mental state within, the eye is the most potent and nearest to the soul within. The eyes have well been called the windows of the soul, and they give a clearer idea of the inner man than all else combined. And, therefore, we may expect our magnetic man to have an eye that reflects the power within him. And we are not disappointed, for even a hasty glance will show that he has what people call an expressive eye. It manifests every mental state, at the will of its owner. Now stern, now tender, now commanding, now loving, now masterful, now caressing. It is an obedient instrument of the will operating it. And it produces the most wonderful suggestive effect upon those coming under its spell. As an inducer of mental states, the eye has no equal among the physical agents. Even the voice, wonderfully potent though it be, must yield precedence to it. It is more than a physical agent, it is a direct avenue for the passage of mentative currents. Very dynamic people, when aroused by deep interest, emotion, or desire, combined with will, seem to have a constant stream of mentative energy flowing from their eyes, which is felt by those within their field of influence. I need not call your attention to the wonderful power of eye, for you are fully acquainted with it from personal experience. You know how power shows itself in the eyes of people. In cases where the will has been developed to a very high degree, it is true that the mentative energy can be so concentrated by a very earnest and powerful glance that an actual physical effect may be produced. I have known and heard of cases in which a powerful glance halted people in their tracks. Cases of this kind are told of Napoleon, and others of developed will power. Andrew Jackson is said to have so paralyzed the will of a noted desperado by his glance that he surrendered meekly and accompanied his captor, although fully armed and heretofore deemed absolutely fearless and dangerous. The desperado afterwards said that he could not understand just why he had not killed Jackson where he stood. It is related in some of the ancient histories, or tales, that one of the old Greeks paralyzed an enemy by a single burning glance. You have all seen people flinch and quail before the masterful glance of one possessed of a developed will power. You, personally, know how this feels. Fothergill says, the steady conflict of the eye is familiar to many of us. The boy looks at his mother to see if she is in earnest in her threat. When older he likewise looks at his schoolmaster to read his purpose. Two men or women look at each other steadily, no word is said, yet the conflict is over soon, and one walks ahead of the other ever after. Oliver Wendell Holmes describes an eye battle as follows: the Kohinoor's face turned so white with rage that his blue-black mustache and beard looked fearful seen against it. He grinned with wrath, and caught at a tumbler, as if he would have thrown its contents at the speaker. The young Marylander fixed his clear, steady eye upon him and laid his hand on his arm, carelessly almost, but the duel felt it was held so that he could not move it. It was of no use. The youth was his master in muscle, and in that deadly Indian hug in which men wrestle with their eyes, over in 5 seconds, but breaks one of their two backs, and is good for 70 years. One trial enough settles the whole matter, just as when two feathered songsters of the barnyard, game and dunghill, come together. After a jump or two at each other, and a few sharp kicks, there is an end of it, and it is a pas vaus, monsieur, with the beaten party in all the social relations for all the rest of his days. The following rules for the cultivation of eye expression were obtained from one of the leading authorities in this line in America. I herewith give them in detail, for those who may desire to practice them. I know of none better for the purpose. Exercises in eye expression. Begin by studying your eyes in a mirror. You will see that in the center of the eyeball there is a black spot. This is called the pupil of the eye. The larger circle surrounding the pupil is called the iris. The white of the eye surrounds the iris. The upper eyelid moving over the eyeball produces a variety of expressions, each giving to the face a totally different appearance, or expression of suggestive meaning. All recognize the meaning of these different expressions, but very few of us understand the mechanism producing the impression. Standing before your mirror, study these various expressions. The following exercises may help you. 1. Hold the upper lid in such a position that its edge rests halfway between the pupil and top of the iris. This gives an expression of calmness. 2. Rest the edge of the upper eyelid at the top of the pupil. This gives an expression of indifference. 3. The edge of the eyelid resting at the top of the iris gives an expression of strong interest. 4. The edge of the eyelid resting halfway over the pupil gives an expression of deep thought. 5. The edge of the eyelid resting just above the edge of the iris, and thus showing a narrow strip of white between the edge of the lid and the edge of the iris, gives an expression of emotional activity. 6. The above position, exaggerated so as to show as much of the white as possible between the edge of the iris and the edge of the lid, will give an expression of emotional excitement. Practice the above expressions and positions. With a little practice, nearly everyone may easily acquire the art of expression in the first 4 exercises, but the last 2 are more difficult of acquirement. The last exercise, emotional excitement especially, is found to be quite difficult of attainment, and but a small percentage are able to produce the expression without considerable practice. Practice these movements until you can reproduce them without the aid of the mirror, just as a man may learn to shave without a mirror, by constant practice before one. The exercises will not only enable you to express the different mental states easily and freely, but will also tend to strengthen the muscles and nerves of the eyes themselves, providing that you proceed gradually and do not overtask the eyes at the beginning. Do not scowl or contract the brows in the practices. A few minutes at a time is all that you should use in practicing. When you have mastered the above exercises, especially numbers 5 and 6, you may try the following, which is the most difficult of all. 7. Rest the eyelid in the position of strong interest, number 3, and then at the same time lift the edge of the underlid to the lower edge of the pupil. This position gives the expression of close scrutiny. You will be surprised at the added power of expression that the careful practice of the above exercises will give you. You will be able to manifest more suggestive feeling, and will induce emotional states of feeling in others. A little practice will give you such convincing proof of this that you will not need urging to further perfect yourself in them. The expressions of emotional activity and emotional excitement especially will produce a startling result if used on appropriate occasions when you wish to exhibit the appearance of the deepest emotional excitement and force. Development exercises. The following development exercises are highly recommended by the same teacher who has devoted years to study and experiment along these lines. 1. Open the eyes quite widely, but not so widely as to strain them, and hold them in that position for a few seconds, gazing into your mirror, which must be directly in front of you on a level with your eyes. While gazing, open them a trifle wider still, without straining, and throw an intense expression into them. Do not move the eyebrows, but allow them to remain normal. 2. Resume the above position, and then change to the expression of strong interest. See previous exercises, looking at yourself in the glass just as you would in looking at another person with that expression. 3. Resume position 1, and then gradually change to the expression of emotional activity. See previous exercises, gazing at yourself in the mirror. 4. Resume position 1, and then gradually change to the expression of emotional excitement. See previous exercises, gazing at yourself in the mirror. 5. Resume position 1, and then gradually change to the expression of close scrutiny. See previous exercises, gazing at yourself in the mirror. In the above exercises you must act as if the reflection of yourself in the mirror were in reality another person whom you wish to influence. The better you act this out, the better will your results be. 6. Practice the expression of strong interest on persons to whom you are listening, until you feel that you have awakened a response in them. I may add that the expression of deep interest consists of but the same expression heightened by more feeling behind it, and the expression of loving interest is the same, only more so. This more feeling may be either real or assumed, as in the case of the good actor. 7. Practice the expression of close scrutiny upon other persons upon appropriate occasions in which you desire to appear as taking a deep, critical interest in some proposition, undertaking, theory, etc. Many persons have built up a reputation for being good listeners and keen observers by this practice. I mention it for what it may be worth to you. I am merely giving you the rules of the game, not necessarily advising you to play it. And now I have reached that part of my subject in which I must speak of the power of the eye to convey mentative force. Owing to some law of nervous mechanism not fully understood as yet, the eye is one of the most effective mediums for the passage of mentative currents from one person to another. I shall not attempt to indulge in any special theory on the subject but shall proceed to the description of the facts of the case. I may add, however, that advanced occultists inform us that portions of the human brain, during a manifestation of strong emotional effort, or exercise of will, resembles an incandescent surface, glowing and phosphorescent. And that also there are seen great beams of this incandescent energy streaming out from the eyes of the person, and reaching the mind of other persons. And more than this, these beams of energy transmit mental states, thoughts, etc., of the person, just as scientists have found that beams of light will carry waves of electricity, and have thus been able to send telegraphic, and even telephonic messages over such beams of light. One who has mastered the fascination of the eye is able to convey most readily to others the mentative currents which tend to produce similar mental states by mentative induction as explained elsewhere in this book. If you will but remember the above illustration of the beam of light along which the electric and magnetic currents travel, and will form a mental picture of these mentative beams from the eye, you will understand the process much better, and you will at the same time tend to give to your own mentative beams a substantial reality, along the lines of visualization. That is, when you wish to use these mentative beams, you should imagine them as actually existing in full force and reality. This will have a tendency to give them a material reality, and thus render them a highly efficient medium for the passage of your mentative currents. And now, right here is the best place to instruct you in the proper use of the eye in what has been called the magnetic gaze, but which would be more properly styled the dynamic gaze. There has been much nonsense written on this subject, and in some of my own earlier writings I gave directions along these lines which I am now able to replace with more approved methods, and later discoveries coming from the study and experimentation of myself and others along these lines. I am willing to improve upon my own methods as well as upon those of others. I have no false pride upon this subject, and if tomorrow I find that I can improve upon my work of today, I shall do so and give my students the benefit of the change, instead of stubbornly sticking to it, just because I had once stated a theory, fact, or result. There is no standing still in scientific work. He who stands still really goes backward. The former instructions regarding the magnetic gaze told the student to concentrate his gaze at the root of the nose of the other person, that is, right between his two eyes. Now this was all very well, but there is a far better plan. This focusing the gaze between the eyes of the other person really results in crossing your gaze, and thus robbing it of a portion of the direct electromagnetic power that it possesses. You may prove this by holding up a pencil before your eyes, and focusing your eyes upon it as you draw it nearer and nearer to your eyes. The nearer you get to the pencil, or to the other person, the more will your gaze be crossed and the effect impaired. A gaze from a pair of crossed eyes is not nearly so dynamic as one from a pair of straight eyes, giving out a direct, forceful impression. The new dynamic gaze is performed as follows. You do not focus your gaze at a point between the two eyes of the other person, but, instead, you gaze directly and straightly into his two eyes with your two eyes. You will find this difficult and tiring if you perform it in the ordinary way, and herein lies the secret. Instead of focusing your eyes upon his, as if you really wish to see the color of his eyes, you must so focus your eyes that you are really gazing through him, as if he were transparent and you wish to see something beyond him. A little practice before a mirror will show you what I mean better than I can explain it to you in words. Practice at gazing through objects will aid you in acquiring this gaze. Try for instance focusing your eyes upon the wall opposite you as you raise your eyes from this page. Then as you look at the wall, slowly pass your hand before your eyes at a distance of about 2 feet, but don't change your focus, don't see the hand plainly. But keep your gaze focused on the wall, as if you could see it through the hand. This gaze must not consist of a blank, vacant, stupid stare, but must be intense and earnest. Practice on objects as above stated, and with your mirror, will aid you in perfecting the gaze. It will help you if you have some friend with whom you can practice it. The other person will not be aware that you are not seeing him, and are gazing through him. To him it will appear that you are giving him a very deep, intense, steady, earnest glance. He will see your pupils dilate, as they always do when looking at a distant object, and your expression will be one of calm, serene power. And another important point about this gaze is that you may maintain it a long time without tiring the eyes, and without the eyes watering or blinking. You may outstare another person, or animal, in this way, without fatigue, while the other's eyes grow tired and weak. So much is this true that the results of my own investigation of the subject have convinced me that the animals who manifest fascination really focus their eyes beyond the object in just this way. If ever you get a chance to observe an animal fascinating another, you will see that I am right in this theory. This gazing through the other person is accomplished by a certain accommodation of the eye, as oculists and opticians call it, and while you are performing it you cannot examine distinctly, or see distinctly the eyes of the other person, because your focus is different. To show you why you are able to maintain this gaze such a long time without tiring your eyes, I would remind you of the ease with which you may maintain the expression of being wrapped in thought, daydreaming, lost in a brown study, just thinking about things, etc., with which you all are familiar. In such a mental state you are able to gaze into space for a long time without the slightest fatigue, while a few seconds focusing your eyes upon a nearby object will tire them very much indeed. And then, again, you know how long you are able to gaze at an object far out at sea, or far across the desert, or far down or across the mountain, without tiring your eyes. The whole secret is that short-range focusing upon an object tires the eyes much more than does long-range gazing into space. This being the case, it will tire you far less seeing through a person, than gazing at him and seeing him at short range. In practicing the maintaining of the gaze for a long time, I would advise against tiring the eyes by gazing at short-range objects. Better practice at gazing at distant objects until you are able to maintain the gaze a long time, as you will be able to do after a little practice. In fact, I advise you to practice the gazing into space, because proficiency in that will enable you to perfect the dynamic gaze. After you have practiced this gazing through method a bit, you will be able to look at an object a couple of feet away, and gaze right through it, that is, you will not consciously see it objectively, although apparently staring hard at it. Avoid all exercises tiring to the eyes, and proceed slowly working from trifling successes to more important ones. You will be surprised how a little intelligent practice along these lines will give you a penetrating glance, firm, earnest, and full of magnetism and fascination, without the slightest sense of strain, fatigue, or effort. You have long wished for such an expression, here it is for you. Chapter 15. Using the mentative instruments. In the use of the eyes for the purpose of conveying mentative currents, you should always remember that the feeling is the real power behind these currents of power, and that the brain is the dynamo from which the currents originate. The brain, you know, is the great transformer, or converter of the mentative energy, and acts just as does a dynamo in the direction of sending forth great waves of power. Consequently, if you wish to send out mentative currents for the purpose of inducing feeling in others, you must first have feeling generated in your mental dynamo. It will be well for two people to practice the eye exercises together, but in the absence of a friend in whom you have confidence, you may obtain excellent results by practicing before your friendly mirror. In either case, you must first arouse in your mind the feeling that you wish to express in mentative currents. Put your feeling into your glance, and it will be felt. Exercise I look into the eyes of your friend, or your own in the mirror, and then say mentally, I am stronger than you. Throw into your glance as much of the feeling of strength as you can. Exercise 2. Say mentally, I am more positive than you, I am outgazing you, throwing as much positivity as possible into your gaze, the same being inspired, of course, by our feeling. Exercise 3. Say, and feel, you are afraid of me, I am making you feel my strength, throwing the feeling into your gaze. After you have acquired the faculty of making your strength felt by above exercises, you may use the same upon other people when the occasion renders it advisable. If you are addressed by some person whom you think is trying to master you mentatively, or whose strong influence you wish to ward off, you may use the above method on him. As a rule, the person who is doing the talking has a slight advantage over the listener, all else being equal. The speaker is the more positive because he is expressing more power. But you may counteract this, if you are the listener, by simply sending him a glance, accompanied by the feeling of "I scatter your force into bits, you cannot affect me." In resisting an attack of this sort, keep your mouth closed, with the jaws tight, for this bite denotes strength and firmness, and brings into play the parts of the brain manifesting these qualities, and thus charges your mentative currents with these feelings. At the same time, gaze firmly and steadily into the eyes of the other, using the dynamic gaze. I would bid you remember that the person standing has an advantage over the one sitting. Avoid the sitting position when the other person is standing. Do not give him this advantage, but take it yourself if you can. In speaking to persons and requesting them to do something, you should accompany the verbal request by a mental command. For instance, if you say, "You will do this for me, won't you?" This is the suggestive form of questioning. Remember, you should accompany the question with the command, made mentally, with the proper glance, "You shall do this." If you are the person requested to do something that you do not wish to do, you should answer, "No, I do not care to do this," or "I do not see my way clear to do it," or "I am unable to oblige you," etc., etc. But at the same time you must send the mental answer, with its accompanying glance, "I will not do it, and you cannot make me." A well-known teacher along these lines several years ago taught his pupils to gaze into the eyes of persons whom they wished to affect, at the same time saying mentally, "I am looking at you. I am looking through your eyes into your brain. My willpower is stronger than yours. You are under my control. I will compel you to do what I wish. You must do what I say. You shall do this. Do it at once." It will readily be seen that this will generate a powerful mentative current, if there is a sufficiently strong feeling, will and desire, behind it. But right here I shall give you an antidote for this kind of influence. In all cases where you are attacked mentally in this way, you may dissolve the force by a positive denial. The positive denial is the powerful force that scatters into tiny bits the force directed against one. It is a destructive agent, just as is the positive statement a constructive or creative one. One who understands the scientific use of this destructive force may undo the mentative work of others, to a surprising degree. By a strong, positive denial, you may scatter and disintegrate any mentative influence directed against you. This formula will give you a general idea of it. Suppose that you are repelling a statement such as given above. In that case you should say mentally, accompanying it with the proper glance, with feeling back of it, "I deny positively your power over me. I deny it out of existence. I will not do your bidding, and I deny your right and power to command me. I deny your power, and I affirm my own." You may cultivate this power to use the positive denial by practicing on an imaginary person whom you may suppose is trying to influence you. Imagine the strong, positive person before you, trying to influence you, and then start into practice the positive denial on him, until you feel that you have beaten him off, and have sent him flying away in retreat. These imaginary mental battles will develop a great power of mentative resistance in you, and I advise you strengthen yourselves along these lines, if you feel that you are weak. You may improve on the above exercise, by imagining that after your enemy is in full retreat you follow him up and pour statement after statement into him, changing your position from a defender into an attacking force. These imaginary rehearsals will do more for one than people think possible. They are like stage rehearsals that make perfect the actors. They are the fencing lessons from which the swordsman gains skill and strength. Practice, practice, practice makes perfect in everything, in mentative work as well as physical. There are good psychological and occult reasons behind this method and practice, but I shall not enter upon that field at present. This book is intended to give you the how of the subject, rather than the why. In personal conversation with another, you will find it of the greatest value to see as clearly as possible a mental picture, chart, or map of what you are saying to him. By so doing, you will impress most forcibly upon his mind that which you wish him to see and feel. In this statement is compressed the secret of effective speaking. In the degree that you see and feel, the thought that you are expressing in words will be the degree of impression made upon, and mentative induction produced in, the other person. The secret, of course, lies in the power of visualization. You may find an evidence of your increasing mentative influence by trying the psychological experiment of willing people to move this way or that way, by gazing intently at them. In this experiment, it is not necessary for you to gaze into their eyes. Gazing at their back, preferably at the upper part of the neck, at the base of the brain, will answer. You may try willing persons to look around on the street, or in public places, etc. Or you may will that they turn to the right or left of you, when approaching each other on the street. Or, in stores, you may will that a certain clerk, from out of a number, will step forward to wait upon you. These and many similar experiments have an interest to the majority of students, and are accomplished with comparative ease, after sufficient practice. The whole theory and practice consists of a steady gaze, and the mental command, and will, that the person will act so and so, together with the earnest expectation that he will obey the command, and the mental picture of his doing so. That is all there is to it. In the use of the eye as a mentative instrument, remember first, last, and all the time, that desire and will are the phases of the mentative energy, and that in the degree that desire is kindled, and will is exerted, so will be the power expressed by yourself, and impressed upon others. Read this book over a number of times, until you have fully grasped the underlying principles. Then commit its exercises and instructions to memory. Then practice frequently, and perfect yourself in the methods pointed out, until you render them second nature. You will be conscious of a gradual growth and development, along the lines of mentative power and influence. The flame of dynamic mentation once lighted, it will never die out. Tend the flame carefully, keep the wick trimmed clean, and fill the lamp with oil, and it will ever burn bright and emit heat and light and power. The last mentative instrument mentioned in a previous chapter is the touch. There was a time, in my early stages of experimentation and psychological research, when I laughed at the idea of the touch playing any real part in the work of mental influence. Of course, I saw the effect of the touch in certain phases of psychological work, but I believed that it was all merely suggestion. But I soon learned that the touch was really a most potent instrument of mentative energy. I now explain it by the idea of the nerves being like the wires upon which the electric current travels. The brain is the dynamo, or converter of the energy, and while the latter travels in waves and currents without any wires, just as do the waves of the wireless telegraph, still if there is a wire to be had, then it follows the lines of least resistance and takes advantage of the nerve wire. Certain parts of the body have nerve cells very highly developed in them, are in fact miniature brains. In the cases of some persons of sensitive and trained touch, there exist little clusters of nerve cells at the ends of the fingers, that act like miniature brains. The lips are also highly developed in this respect, as the well-known phenomena of kissing evidences. The fingers and hand are excellent polar mediums for conveying the mentative energy that pours down over the nerves from the brain, and through which it passes to the other person. The use of the touch of the hands as a channel for conveying mentative energy depends greatly upon the development of the hands by the individual. Those who understand this matter, develop the conductivity of the hands by treating them as follows. Think of your hands as excellent conductors of mentative energy, and imagine that you can feel the energy pouring down the nerves of your arms, and out of your hands, obeying your will, when you shake hands with people. You will soon develop your hands to such a degree that some sensitive persons will actually feel the current passing into them. Always accompany the passage of the current with the thought or feeling that you wish to induce in the other person, just as you do when you use the dynamic gaze. In fact, the gaze and the hand clasp should be used together, when possible, for by so doing you double the effect. When you shake hands with a person, throw mind and feeling into it, and do not fall into the mechanical, lifeless methods so common among people. Throw your feeling down to your hand, and at the same time make a mental command or statement appropriate to the case. For instance, grasp the person's hand with feeling and interest, saying, mentally, at the same time, "You like me." Then, when you draw your hand away, if possible, let your fingers slide over the palm of his hand in a caressing manner, allowing his first finger to pass between your thumb and forefinger, close up in the crotch of the thumb. Practice this well, until you can perform it without thinking of it, that is, make it your natural way of shaking hands. You will find that this method of shaking hands will open up a new interest in people toward you, and in other ways you will discover its advantage. You never knew a fascinating person who did not have a good hand clasp. It is a part of the fascinating personality. There are many persons, well grounded on the psychological principles underlying the subject, who use the hands as a medium for mentative energy, without shaking hands. For instance, they sit near the other person and place their hands so that their fingers will point toward him, at the same time willing that the current flow through the fingers and toward the other. They also use their hands in conversation so as to have the tips of their fingers pointing toward the other. This last plan becomes highly effective when used with the appropriate gestures, for it is akin to the mesmeric pass of the hands. In this connection, I would say beware of the person who is always trying to put his hands on you, beware of the pawing over process. Avoid it in the ordinary way, if possible, or else deliberately practice the positive denial toward the person, holding the idea and mental statement that I deny the power of your magnetism, I scatter it by my denial. In concluding this chapter, I would especially caution young women, and older ones for that matter, against allowing men to be familiar with them in the direction of holding hands, or similar practices. Not only does this familiarity breed contempt, but there are good psychological reasons why the practice is to be condemned. You have seen what part the hands play in magnetizing, as it is called, and is it not clearly discernible how one may use the hands in this petting, and all that sort of thing, in order to psychologically affect another person? I am not speaking now of the caresses indulged in by honorable true lovers, for all the talk in the world would not change that sort of thing, but I am alluding to the indiscriminate pawing over on the part of strange men that some young girls allow. There is a danger in this sort of thing, and I want you to know it. If you have daughters, or young female relatives, warn them against this thing, and tell them the reason why. And the same thing is true of the man who is always patting other men on the shoulder, or resting his arm around them, or else taking hold of them in a friendly, caressing way during a conversation. Such men may not know the psychology of the thing, but they have found out that this sort of patting up makes other men more impressible, and amenable to their influence, and so they practice it. Make them stop it, either by moving away, or by positive denial. Now, once more, remember the power of this positive denial as a disperser and disintegrator of adverse influence. If this book taught you nothing else, it would still be worthwhile to you because of this one point of instruction. For this positive denial is a mentative armor that will protect you, a mentative sword that will defend you, a mentative lightning flash that will clear the mental atmosphere. Learn the secret of positive statement and positive denial, and you are clad in an invulnerable armor and are armed with the weapon of power, and so you may, like the warrior bold, go gaily to the fray. But, after all, the secret of influence in our dynamic individual lies in his mental states. The outer forms are but reflections of the inner. If you will cultivate the connection between your mind and the great universal will, the universal mind power, then your will becomes so strong that the outward expressions will come of themselves. But in mounting the first steps of attainment, it becomes important for the student to pay attention to the outward characteristics, because by so doing he makes a clearer mental path for the acquisition of the desired mental states. By the very laws of mental suggestion he is able to imitate these outward expressions, and thus induce in himself the mental states, which, in time, become habitual. I do not mean that one should allow the suggestion of the other's appearance to move him in this way, this is not the idea. What I mean is that one may by autosuggestion so reproduce the outward characteristics associated with a desired mental state or quality, and by acting them out actually materialize into reality the mental states themselves. Remember the rule: mental states take form in action, and action reproduces their associated mental states. It is a rule that works both ways. The voice makes the phonographic record and the latter reproduces the sound. Remember this illustration, for it will help you to get the right conception of the psychological law underlying the phenomenon. There is a certain point to which I would direct your attention at this stage. I refer to the well-known psychological fact that mental states express themselves in physical action. Every mental state has its associated physical action. And these actions, when perceived by another person, are apt to induce similar mental states in that person, along the lines of mental suggestion. But there is another law, less understood by the public, and that is that the manifestation of physical action tends to induce in the mind of the person performing it the mental states generally associated with the production of the action. Let us take a common example to illustrate the operation of these two related laws. Let us suppose that you are holding a mental state of anger, fight, combativeness, etc. In that case you will find that your brows will frown, your jaws will be fixed in a savage bite, and slightly protruded, and your hands will be clenched. The mental state has taken form in physical action. Very well, then you all recognize this fact. But there is the law reversed. If you will frown deeply, clench your fists savagely, fix your jaws in a fighting trim, etc., and will maintain that physical attitude for 5 minutes, at the same time allowing it to manifest in your walk, etc., as it surely will, without interference, you will find yourself growing into a mental state of annoyance, combativeness, etc., and if you keep it up long enough, you will be mad in earnest. So true is this that if you carry the thing far enough, and run into someone else, you will be very apt to get into a row with him. And, still more remarkable is the fact, the person that you run into will be very apt to take up the mental suggestion of your manner, and will also feel fighty. It would not take much to stir up trouble between the two of you. And, still more remarkable, if you continue this physical attitude until it produces the mental state, you will find that you are inducing similar mental states in those around you, by the agency of mentative currents. So you see the close connection between physical action, mental states, suggestion, and telementation. They act and react upon each other. What has been said of the mental state of anger applies equally to any intense feeling or mental state. Like begets like, along all the lines mentioned. Now, all this means that the man who is possessed of a strong mental state will manifest, unconsciously, the physical actions which will affect others, along the lines of mental suggestion. He will not have to study the question of what suggestions to use, providing he feels sufficiently strong to automatically manifest the actions. But when a man does not feel sufficiently strong to manifest the suggestive actions, he may produce the same effect by acting the part, without being actually involved in it, by first reproducing the physical actions, which will thus induce a sufficiently strong mental state to manifest itself both along the line of suggestion, and also along the line of personal magnetism. Every good actor induces feeling in you in this way, along both these lines. And you may do the same if you want to. Many dynamic people are doing it every day. On this subject, so far as I have gone, I have given you a most important secret of psychological influence, in a plain, practical way, so simple in fact that there is a risk of many of you entirely overlooking its importance. Better go back over this part of the lesson again many times, until you are able to catch its inner meaning, and are able to read between its lines. It's quite worthwhile, I assure you. Of course, some of my kind critics will take me to task for teaching this acting out idea. They will call it inculcating principles of deceit, etc., etc., and will then go on their way admiring magnetic personalities, and regretting the absence of tact in other persons who have rubbed them the wrong way. I have noticed that these hypercritical people are generally hypercritical as well. I have known many good men who were not dynamic, and the world turned them down, and often jumped all over them. And I have known quite a number, not quite so good, who possessed quite a goodly degree of dynamic force, and the world received them with open arms, and showered its praises and rewards upon them. But this does not mean that one cannot be good and dynamic at the same time. There are plenty of good men who are highly dynamic, and there are plenty of bad men equally so. And there are plenty both good and bad, who lack dynamic force. But, note this fact, please, that the good men, and the bad men, who are highly dynamic, generally manage to get there, along their own line of life. And both the good and bad who lack dynamic force are generally stranded along the wayside. Dynamic force is neither good nor bad, it is a natural force and is used by all. In this respect it is like any other natural force. And, then again, this book is not for the purpose of teaching the bad use of dynamic force, rather than the good. It states the principles and the law, as they are. It is true that the bad man may take advantage of the law and use it for bad purposes, but so may the good man take advantage of it and make himself a greater power for good. Dynamic force is just as effective in the preacher as it is in the confidence man, and just as effective in the salesman and businessman, an everyday person, as it is in either the preacher or the confidence man. It is a natural quality, and has nothing to do with good and bad any more than has elocution, oratorical ability, or personal appearance. If the good folk prefer to leave this important subject for the bad folk, that is their own concern, not mine. Personally, I feel like the old preacher, who was remonstrated with by some hidebound old parishioner regarding certain musical innovations that had been introduced in the church service. The old preacher looked kindly at the old veteran conservative of the flock, and said, "Well, brother, it may strike you in a different way, but to me it seems wrong to allow the devil to monopolize all the good music. I believe in giving the Lord his share of it." And I say amen to this idea. If dynamic mentation was as much used to further the interests of right, as it has been to further the interests of wrong, the old world would get down to a little easier motion. If the preacher would make his talks as dynamic as the actor does his plays, and the lawyer does his appeals to the jury, there would surely be something doing in church work, and the prevailing emptiness of the pews would be cured. If goodness was made as attractive as badness, the devil would be placed on the retired list. Chapter 16. Mental Suggestion. Before beginning our consideration of the subject of mental suggestion, let me call your attention to the following general statements regarding mentative induction, in which general subject is included the subdivisions called personal magnetism, mental suggestion, and telementative induction, respectively. 1. Mental states may be caused by mentative induction. Two. Such induced mental states may be caused by the mentative currents of personal magnetism, or by the mentative currents of telementation, or by mental suggestion. Three. Mentative currents are waves or streams of vibrant mind power, emanating from the minds of people, and carrying with them the vibrations of mental states, the vibrations tending to induce similar mental states in the minds of people within the field of induction. B. There are two poles of mind power, i.e., the emotive pole, manifesting desire, feeling, emotion, etc., and the motive pole, manifesting will, etc., the acting force, affecting other minds, manifested by these two poles being called desire force and willpower, respectively. C. Desire force tends to awaken similar vibrations in the minds of others, thus producing similar desires, or it charms the wills of others and causes them to carry out its desires, its action and nature bearing a strong resemblance to feminine mental power. D. Willpower tends to awaken desire in the minds of others by sheer mastery and forcefulness. It also acts in the direction of combating and overpowering the wills of others, and taking them captive. It also directs, masters, concentrates, or restrains one's own desire force. On occasions, its action bears a strong resemblance to masculine mental power. E. When the mentative currents are emanated, and mentative induction is manifested, when the projector and recipients are in the personal presence of each other, we use the term personal magnetism. When the same manifestation occurs when the projector and recipients are not in the personal presence of each other, then we use the term telementative induction. But the principle employed is the same in each case, induction through telementation being the operative principle. In personal magnetism, however, mental suggestion usually assists in the induction of mental states. For this reason, mental suggestion should be studied in connection with personal magnetism, being supplementary thereto. 4. Mental suggestion induces mental states by reproducing the original mental states of others, or one's own previously experienced mental states, including the experience of the race ancestors, inherited and recorded in the subconscious minds of their descendants. Suggestion operates along the lines of acquiescence, imitation, association, and repetition, always acting through physical agents for inducing mental states. In personal magnetism, the mentator pours out his mentative currents, generated by his will or desire, or both, either in a general way, or in a concentrated, directed manner, in a personal interview, and thus influences the mind of others by induction. This is usually, or always, accompanied by mental suggestion, using physical agents, such as the voice, eye, manner, etc., which heighten the effect produced. And, now, with the understanding of the above stated general principles, let us proceed to a consideration of the subject of mental suggestion. Every student of psychology and mental science has heard and read much of that phase of mental phenomena called mental suggestion. Much has been written and taught about it, and the term has been claimed by some teachers to cover all phases of mental influence. I do not entirely agree with these extreme advocates of suggestion, however, for I find much in the subject that calls for a further explanation. But, nevertheless, I feel certain that mental suggestion plays a most important part in almost every instance of this class of phenomena and must be seriously considered by all careful students of the subject. Combined with mentative induction by means of mentative currents, it accounts for nearly every phase of the phenomena of mental influence. Therefore, I shall devote several chapters to the consideration of its underlying principles, laws, and method of application. I feel that no one can be a successful practitioner of telementative influence or personal magnetism who is not a good suggestionist, because the very knack of projecting strong suggestions is necessary for the forceful projection of mentative energy and mental currents. While all who have examined the subject are aware of the force and effects of mental suggestion, few have found it possible to correctly define or describe the term, or to explain it to others. But I feel assured that my theory of mentative induction, and the two poles of mind power will enable you to form a very clear and comprehensive knowledge of the underlying laws of the subject, so that, understanding it, you will be able to apply its method of application to the best advantage. Mental suggestion is the term used to designate the process of inducing or exciting mental states or ideas, by means of the imagination, by the agency of words, actions, outward appearances, or other physical symbols. I divide the phenomena of mental suggestion into two general classes or phases, i.e., 1. Active suggestion, and 2. Passive suggestion, as follows. By active suggestion I mean the induction or excitement of mental state or ideas in others by means of positive command, affirmation, statements, etc., bearing directly upon the desired mental state. By passive suggestion I mean the induction or excitement of mental state or ideas by the subtle insinuation, introduction, or insertion of ideas into the minds of others, which insinuated ideas act in the direction of inducing the desired mental state. Active suggestion is associated with the use of the motive pole of the mind of the suggester, and passive suggestion is associated with the emotive pole of the suggester. One is the masculine method and the other the feminine. And here is a good place in which to direct your attention to a very important fact concerning the operation of suggestion in inducing mental states in others. I allude to the fact that suggestion operates along the line of emotional mentality, feeling, or imagination, and has nothing to do with judgment, reason, argument, proof, etc. It belongs clearly to the feeling side of the mind, rather than to the thinking side. One's reason may be appealed to by clever reasoning, argument, logic, proof, etc., and an effect gained, but this belongs to an entirely different phase of mental action. The induction of mental states in others by means of suggestion has to do entirely with the feeling or imaginative phase of the mind. It deals with the production of emotional mentality rather than with rational mentality. This is a most important point, and one that should be thoroughly understood by all students of the subject. It is true that suggestion may accompany an appeal to the reason or judgment of the person influenced, and, indeed, is generally so used, but, strictly speaking, it constitutes an appeal to a part of the mind entirely removed from reasoning and judgment. It is emotional, and imaginative first, last, and all the time. And it operates along the same lines as the mental induction produced by mentative currents, as we shall see. And now, with this preliminary understanding, let us pass on to a consideration of the meaning of the terms used. There is nothing like a clear understanding of the terms employed in treating of a subject. If one understands the exact meaning of the terms, he has progressed very far to an exact understanding of the subject itself, for the terms are the crystallized ideas involved in the subject. To understand the full and complete meaning of the terms of any subject is to know the whole subject thoroughly, for no one can understand a term thoroughly until he knows it in all of its relations, all that pertains to it. Let us start with the word suggestion as used by the writers on mental suggestion. Some authorities give the broad, general definition of anything that is impressed upon the mind through the senses, but this I consider entirely too sweeping, for this definition would make the term cover knowledge of all sort, no matter to what part of the mind it appealed, for all knowledge of the outward world is obtained through the senses. Other authorities define the term as anything insinuated into the mind, subtly, cautiously, and indirectly, this definition fitting nearly the one favored by the dictionaries in defining the word suggestion in its general sense, which is as follows: a hint, a guarded mention, an intimation, something presented to the mind directly, an insinuation, etc. But this last definition of mental suggestion does not fit all the phases of the subject. It fits admirably into the phase known as passive suggestion, which operates by direct, forceful command, statement, etc. And so I must give my own definition of the term to fit my conception of an understanding of its meaning. I, therefore, here define my use of the term a mental suggestion as follows: a physical agency tending to induce or excite mental states or ideas through the imagination. This is a broad definition, which, I think, will cover all the observable phenomena of mental suggestion. I use the word physical to distinguish suggestive agents from the mental agents inducing mental states by the operation of mentative currents, telementation, etc. Of course, this distinction will not please those who would claim all mental action as a form of the physical, or vice versa. But as I have to draw the line somewhere, I prefer to draw it between the physical agent and the mental, and I think that the majority of my readers will approve of this position. The word agent means, of course, an acting power or cause, etc. The word inducing, as I have used it, has been defined in the previous lesson. The word excite means to call into activity in any way, to rouse to feeling, to kindle to strong emotions. The imagination is that phase of mind which creates mental images, or objects, or sensation previously experienced. In my use of the term physical in the above definition, I include all words, spoken, written, or printed, mannerisms, physical actions of all kinds, physical, characteristics and appearances, etc., etc. All of these physical manifestations act as agents inducing mental states under favorable circumstances. By mental states I mean states of feeling or emotion. By ideas, I mean images of objects conceived of by the mind. It may be urged that the use of words, spoken, written or printed, may be employed, and are employed, in every appeal to the mind of another, whether the appeal be along the lines of suggestion or argument, reason, etc. Certainly. And in that sense they act as suggestions. Arguments appeal to judgment and reason, but not to feeling, emotion or imagination, which are, on the contrary, excited or induced by suggestions or other forms of emotional induction. One may present an idea to the mind of another, in a bold, forcible, logical manner, accompanied by argument or proof, but this is an appeal to reason and judgment, not to feeling or emotion, which belong to an entirely different field of the mind. Then again, many personal appeals, which are apparently made to reason, are really made to the emotional side. One may subtly insinuate into an argument or conversation an appeal to the feelings or emotion of the hearer, in the shape of an idea in the nature of a hint, or indirect mention. Such idea will be felt by the listener, who will accept it into his mind, and before long he will regard it as one of his own thoughts, he will make it his own. He will think that he thought it, whereas, really, he simply feels it, and the feeling is induced. This is a case of suggestion. In ordinary social intercourse you will find that women are adepts in this subtle form of insinuative suggestion, as compared to men. Men will blurt out statements and ideas, and attempt to prove them, but the woman will gently insinuate the idea into the mind of the other person, so that, without having proven a fact, she will have managed to create a definite idea of feeling in the mind of the other by suggestion. I think I need not give examples of this fact, it is apparent to all who have mingled with people. And really this suggestion resembles the mental suggestion of the psychologists very much. It is true that the practitioner of mental suggestion, in his treatments, often makes use of direct, forceful statements, such as, "You are strong, cheerful, well and happy," but you will notice even here that he does not argue the point, or attempt to prove his statements. He simply affirms and asserts the fact, and by constantly repeated suggestions he finally causes the mind of the other person to accept the statement. So you see, a suggestion may be either a subtle insinuation or a bold, positive statement, but it is never an argument, or process of proof. The word impression is good, as applied to the effect of a suggestion, but I prefer to stick to my own terms, and therefore I shall consider that the effect of mental suggestion is caused by induction. What, you may say, I thought that induction was a term used when a mental state was set up in one by mentative currents from the mind of another. Yes, this is true, but my last statement is true also. An induced mental state is one set up by outside influence of some kind, whether that outside influence be a mentative current or by suggestion through a word, a look, a sight, or anything else. The word induce, means to lead, to influence, to prevail on, to effect, to cause, etc. And any mental state that is induced by an outside influence comes clearly under the term. Any physical agent that tends to induce a feeling in the mind of another may be called a suggestion. Even the well-known instance mentioned in the textbooks on psychology comes under this rule. In that instance it is related that a soldier was carrying some bundles and a pail to his barracks, when some practical joker yelled to him in an authoritative voice, "Attention!" Following the suggestion, which induced in him the feeling preceding certain habitual actions, he dropped his pail and bundles with a crash and stood at attention, with eyes front, chin out, protruding breast, stomach drawn in, and hands at his sides with little fingers touching the seams of his trousers. That was a suggestion. Do you see the point? The lives of all of us have been molded largely by induction through suggestion. We accepted this suggestion, or that one, and it changed the whole current of our lives. Certain things induced certain feelings, called into activity certain mental states, and action followed close upon the heels of feeling. There are varying degrees of suggestive power, just as there are varying degrees of what is called the suggestibility of persons, that is the tendency to accept suggestions. There are people who scarcely ever act from motives originating within themselves, but whose entire lives are lived out in obedience to the suggested ideas and feelings of others. The development of the willpower regulates the degree of suggestibility. The man of the strong will is not so easily affected by a suggestion as is one whose will is weak, and who accepts without resistance the suggestions coming from all sides. But note the apparent paradox: persons of weak will may have their wills so developed and strengthened by scientific suggestive treatment that they may become veritable giants of will. The careful student may feel inclined to ask me, at this point, why I speak of suggested ideas, when I have said that suggestion has to do with mental states of feeling and emotion. Are not ideas, he asks, something connected with thought rather than with feeling? The question is a proper one, and I must meet it. The word idea comes from the Greek word, meaning to see. In its general use it means a mental image, or a general notion or conception held in the mind. An idea is symbolic image held in the mind. It is a symbol of something thought or felt. Ideas are not formed by thought alone, feeling contributes its share of these mental images. To tell the truth, the majority of people scarcely think at all, in the highest sense of the word. Their reasoning and logical faculties are very rudimentary. They accept their ideas at second-hand or second-hundred hand, their thoughts must be predigested for them by others, and the handed-down idea is the result. The majority of ideas held in the mind of the race arise from feeling and emotion. People may not understand things, but they have experienced feelings or emotions regarding them, and have consequently formed many ideas and ideals therefrom. They do not know just why an idea is held by them, they know only that they feel it that way. And the majority of people are moved, swayed, and act by reasons of induced feelings, rather than by results of reasoning. I am not speaking of intuitional feelings now, but of the plain, everyday, emotional feeling of people. Do you know what a feeling is? The word, used in this sense, means a mental state, emotion, passion, sympathy, sentiment, susceptibility, etc. And emotion means an excitement of the feelings. Feelings belong to the instinctive side of our mind, rather than to the rational or reasoning side. They spring up from the subconscious strata of the mind, in response to the exciting cause coming from without. The instinctive part of our minds are stored with the experiences, feelings, emotions, and mental states of our long line of ancestors, reaching away back to the early beginnings of life. In that part of the mind are sleeping instincts, emotions, and feelings, our inheritance from the past, which await but the inducing cause to call them into activity. The reason or judgment, by means of the will, act as a restrainer, of course, according to the degree of development of the individual. And these outward agents, if of a physical nature, are suggestions of all kinds. Look around you at the world of men and women. Then tell me whether they seem to be moved principally by reason or feeling. Are their actions based upon good judgment and correct and careful reasoning? Or are they the results of feeling and emotion? Do people do things because the things are considered right in the light of reason, or do they do them because they feel like it? Which produces the greatest motive force, an appeal to the reason of a number of people, or an appeal to their feelings and emotion? Which sways a gathering of people, the votes of a people, the actions of a mob, reason or feeling? Which moves even you, good student, reason or feeling? Answer the questions honestly, and you will have the key of suggestive influence. Chapter 17. 4 kinds of suggestion. Mental suggestion produces its effect upon the minds of people along one or more of 4 general lines or paths of action. All the phenomena coming under this head may be placed in one or more of the four classes. These four paths, or lines of action, along which mental suggestion operates, are as follows. 1. Obedience. 2. Imitation. 3. Association. 4. Repetition. I shall now proceed to consider these four paths, or lines of action, separately, in order, and in detail. Beginning with the first mentioned line of action, let us consider suggestion through obedience. Suggestion operating along this line consists of the induction of mental states, etc., by the agency of a positive statement, assertion, assumption, authoritative attitude, etc., which so impresses itself upon the mind of the person suggested to that he sets up no opposition or resistance, but acquiesces quietly to the suggestion made to him. The most common form of this first method of suggestion is seen in the very general acquiescence to real or pretended authority on the part of the majority of people. When such people hear a statement made, positively and in a tone of conviction, by some person in authority, they accept the statement, and the feelings arising from the accepted statement, without resistance, and without any attempt to submit the matter to the exercise of their reason. And this is true not only when the person speaking has really a right to speak authoritatively, by virtue of his knowledge, experience, wisdom, etc., but also when some pretender sets up an appearance of authority, and speaking in a positive style, assuming the "thus saith the Lord" manner, impresses his hearers with the idea he wishes to suggest to them. And then the good folk meekly acquiesce without question and allow their feelings to be aroused accordingly, for the feelings are generally followed by actions in accord therewith. It is astonishing, from one point of view, to see how obedient to this form of suggestion the masses of people are. They will allow their mental states, feelings, and emotion to be induced by the impudent statements and claims of cunning, shrewd, and designing men, as well as by ignorant self-deluded fanatics, who thus influence and sway them. These self-constituted authorities utter their oracular statements and opinions in a tone of absolute certainty, and the crowd takes them at their own valuation. It seems to be only necessary for some positive man to attract the attention of the people and then make some bold claim or statement, in the proper manner and tone, and with their appearance of authority, and lo! Some of the people, at least, fall into line. Did you ever think that people as a rule are obedient animals? Well, they are, providing you can manage to impress them with your authority. It is much easier for them to acquiesce than to refuse to do so. They find it easier to say and think yes rather than no. Their will is not often called into action by their reason and judgment, it being too often entirely under the control of the feeling and emotional side of them. There is a fundamental law under this phase of suggestive action, and in order to find it we must go back to the beginning of the race, perhaps farther. In the earlier days among animals and men, there were natural leaders, who ruled by force of might of body or mind. These natural leaders were implicitly obeyed by the masses, who had learned by experience that it was better for the tribe, or herd, as a whole, to be governed by their strongest and sharpest-witted members. And so gradually this dominant idea of acquiescence and obedience to authority developed and became a fixture in the race mind. And it is firmly planted in the mind of the race today, so much so that only the strongest minds are able to free themselves from it to any great extent. It is authority here, and authority there, in law, letters, religion, politics, and every other field of human endeavor. People do not begin by asking themselves, "What do I think about this matter?" but instead start off by saying, "What does so-and-so think of it?" Their so-and-so is their authority, who does their thinking for them, and they take their keynote from him or her. The authority induces their mental states for them. If these leaders and authorities were really the wisest of the race, it would not matter so very much, although even then it might prevent the development of individuality in the masses. But the worst feature is that the majority of these authorities don't know, and know that they don't know, but the people haven't found them out. They assume the manners, air, appearance, etc., of the real thing, and the people being accustomed to these symbols of authority, and mistaking the imitation article for the real, are impressed by the authoritative utterance and accept the suggestion. This fact is well known to the classes that prey upon the public. The confidence men, in and out of the criminal class, assume this air of authority, and their suggestions are accepted by the people. They are good actors, that is one of the requisites of the suggestionist, and these people understand the law. They proceed upon the theory accredited to Aaron Burr, that remark, you may remember, was that the law is that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. And so these folk keep on boldly asserting, and plausibly maintaining, and find that it generally goes. To see a principle in its naked simplicity, one should look for its operation in extreme instances. And the extreme instance in this case is the hypnotic subject who has surrendered his judgment entirely to the mind of the operator. The subject will acquiesce in the most absurd suggestions from the operator and proceed to carry them into effect. And suggestion, is the active factor in hypnotism, the hypnotic condition being only a psychological condition in which the effect of suggestion is heightened. But one does not have to go to the ranks of the somnambules for striking illustrations, for such are to be found in all walks of life among people who have no individuality of their own, but who seem to live and act entirely upon the say-so of others. They have no quality of initiative, but must always be told just what to do, and how to do it, by others. These people will accept almost any kind of suggestion, if made by others in an authoritative tone and manner. They do not have to be persuaded by argument, but are fairly driven and ordered to do things by stronger-willed persons. They are impressionable and sensitive, and seem to have no wills of their own. These people are very suggestible, and every day's history records many startling cases of the effect of suggestion through acquiescence on the part of such people. The keynote of this form of suggestion is a positive statement or command, given with the air and appearance of authority. The secret of the effect is the tendency upon the part of the majority of people to acquiesce in an authoritative statement or command, rather than to dispute it, and the tendency toward thinking yes rather than no. This form of suggestion is to be observed in the highest degree among those who have always depended upon others for orders, or instruction, and who have not had to use their own wits and resources in life. Unskilled laborers and the sons of rich men belong to this class as a rule. These people seem to need someone to do their thinking for them, even in the smallest events of their lives, and are most suggestible along these lines. Then the degree of suggestibility along these lines decreases as we ascend among people who have had to do things for themselves, and who have not depended upon others so much. It is the slightest among people who have had the ordering of others to do, or who have had to depend upon their own wits in getting through life. The men of marked degree of initiative have scarcely a trace of this form of suggestibility. Initiative, is a term for doing things without being told, using one's own wits and resources, the true American spirit, which so many Americans lack. The degree of power in giving this form of suggestion depends materially upon the development of will on the part of the suggester, and also upon his assumption of the appearance, manners, air and tone of authority, the latter requisites being the outward symbols. If one has the willpower strongly developed, the symbols will appear of themselves as a natural consequence. But to those who have not the developed willpower, and whose authority is more or less counterfeit, the assumption of the outward symbols becomes a matter of great importance, and these people devote much study to the cultivation of these outward forms. And these counterfeit symbols, the art of the actor, serve their purpose to impress and suggest to the crowd, and their assumers set up a very brave front and obtain a very fair degree of success in the part they are acting, that is, until they come in contact with a man of real willpower, when they gracefully retire after the first clash of mentative swords. To those who are negative and who are too susceptible to this form of suggestion, I advise the cultivation of willpower, which will be fully taught in the later chapters of this book, entitled Mental Architecture, etc. Nothing but the cultivation of the will render one positive and impervious to suggestive influences of this sort. The second line of action of mental suggestion is that called suggestion through imitation. This form of mental suggestion is very common, perhaps the most common of all the forms. Man is essentially an imitative animal. He is always copying the actions, appearances, and ideas of others, thereby going to prove his descent from the monkey-like ancestors, in whom this trait of character was largely developed. Personally, I believe that those traits of imitation may be traced back to the early days of the race, or before, when animals and men were in a wild state, and exposed to constant danger of attack of enemies. Then a motion of fright on the part of one would be communicated to the others of the tribe, and gradually the trait of instinctive imitation was developed, the traces of which are still strongly with the race, even to this day. We may find instances of this trait all around us. When we watch a tightrope walker, our bodies instinctively sway in imitative motion. When we watch the faces of actors on the stage, our own faces work in sympathy, more or less. And so it goes on all around us, and in us ever the tendency toward imitation. Children manifest a great degree of this trait and copy and acquire the mannerisms of those around to a surprising degree of detail. This form of mental suggestion is very common. People are constantly taking up the suggestion of the mental states, feelings, and emotions of those around them, and reproducing them in their own acts. The majority of people are like human sheep, who will follow a leader everywhere and along all sorts of paths. Let the old bellwether jump over a rail, and every sheep in the flock will do likewise, and they will keep on jumping over the same place, at the same height, even if the rail be removed before the whole flock gets over. We are constantly doing things simply because other people do them. We are constantly aping after others. In our fashions, styles, forms, etc. We are servile imitators. Larry Hare shows a vest button hung by a thread and all the young apes in the land follow suit. Funny, isn't it? This law of imitation plays an important part in the phenomena of mental suggestion along these lines. Somebody does a certain thing and at once other people take up the suggestion and copy the original actor. Let the newspaper record a certain crime and many others of the same type follow closely after. Let there be a suicide, and many others follow, usually adopting the same methods. Let there be a number of cases of some kind of folly and dissipation, and immediately there is an epidemic of the same thing. Let the papers say much about the appearance of a new disease, and at once a number of people manifest symptoms of it. Diseases get to be quite the fashion in this way. The feelings and emotions of the instinctive part of the mind are called into sympathetic action along the lines of imitative suggestion, and physical effects follow shortly after. Shrewd men take advantage of this tendency of the human mind, and, by getting a few people interested in certain things, they manage to set the fashion, and the crowd follows like sheep. Get people talking about a thing, and the contagion spreads until everybody is interested in the matter. The majority of people are more or less susceptible to this form of suggestion, the degree depending upon their habit of thinking, judging, and acting for themselves. The man or woman who has ideas of his, or her, own, is not so apt to be impressed by every wave of popular fashion, style, and thought as those who maintain a more negative attitude toward the minds of others. The method of curing an undue tendency toward imitative action is to start and to build up your individuality, and to develop positivity, along the lines mentioned in the concluding chapters of this book. The third line of action of mental suggestion is suggestion through association. This form of mental suggestion is very common. It is based upon the acquired impressions of the race, by which certain words, actions, manners, tones, appearances, etc., are associated with certain previously experienced mental states. Mental states take form in physical action and expression, as we know. A man feeling in a certain way is apt to express himself by certain actions or in certain words. These actions and words thus become symbols of the mental state producing them, and consequently they produce upon the mind of the person seeing or hearing them the mental image connected with that mental state. And this mental image is calculated to induce a similar or corresponding state in the mind of the person seeing and hearing. So that these symbols are really mental suggestions, since they tend to induce mental states. I wish to remind you that every written, printed, or spoken word, or words, is the outward and physical expression of some inner mental state of the person uttering or writing the words. The words are the outward and visible signs of an inward feeling. Remember this always. Mere words, in themselves, have no suggestive value. The value depends upon the meaning impressed upon them by the mind of the person using them, accompanied by an understanding of their meaning by the person hearing or reading them. The word horror, for instance, or uncanny, has a definite meaning to persons familiar with it. It bears a direct relation to a mental feeling, or emotion, and is the physical and outward expression of the same. One may say the word over and over again to a person who has never heard it, or to one of another race who does not understand the term, and no suggestive effect follows. But speak the word to one who is accustomed to connect and associate it with a definite feeling that they have experienced, and the feeling will be produced, or induced, if the circumstances of the use of the word be favorable. The word love, used properly, will awaken in the mind of its hearers feelings corresponding with the term. And these feelings must have been experienced before, either directly or indirectly, before they may be induced by suggestion. Feelings experienced by one's ancestors leave a record in one's subconscious mentality, which may also be induced by the appropriate suggestion. Personally, words seem to me to be like the wax record of a phonograph. The record is covered with minute impressions produced by the sound waves entering the phonograph. Place this record in its place in the phonograph and start the latter in motion, and lo! The minute impressions on the record will reproduce or induce in the diaphragm the same kind of sound waves that originally caused the impressions. In this way a word, which is the physical symbolic record of feeling, will produce its associated feeling in the mind of the person hearing or reading it. And, as I have said, the feeling produced will depend largely upon the understanding of the meaning of the word held by the person receiving the impression. For instance, in the case of the word love, let us suppose that the term is strongly and feelingly suggested to a number of persons at the same time, and in the same way. You will find that the feeling induced in the one person will be that of love of parents, in another love of children, in another love of husband or wife, in another love of God, in another an exalted affection for some person of the opposite sex, in another the low animal passion for one of the other sex, and so on, each experiencing a feeling occasioned by his or her association of the word with some feeling previously entertained. The same word may induce a feeling of the greatest pleasure in one person, and the greatest horror or disgust in another, the difference depending upon the association of the word in the mind of the two persons. I have dwelt upon these facts in order to make clear to you that there is no magic power in words in themselves, and that all their force and effect depends upon the associated feeling of which they are the crystallized physical and outward form or symbol. The word is the body, the feeling is its soul. And so it is with the suggestion of appearance, manner, surrounding, etc. Each of these depends for force and effect upon some accustomed association with some inner feeling, which feeling is reproduced or induced by the outward symbol of the thing. We associate certain things with certain feelings, and when we see these things we are apt to experience the feeling indicated. People have been overcome by the sight of a picture, or a scene in a play, a song, a poem, or suggestive music. And here is where the art of the suggestionist comes into play. He watches closely and discovers that certain words, tones, manners, appearances, actions, motions, etc., are associated in the minds of people with certain feelings and ideas. And so when he wishes to reproduce, produce, or induce in others these ideas or feelings, he simply reproduces the associated physical symbols, in words, manner, motion, or appearance, and the effect is produced. The conjurer makes certain motions with his hands which you have always associated with certain actions, and you feel that the action itself has been performed, but the conjurer omits the action, and you are fooled. The confidence man assumes the appearance, manners, and actions which you have always associated with certain qualities of character, and you feel that he is what he seems to be, but he isn't, and you are fooled. This play-acting of people is all a form of suggestion, and you are fooled because you accept the symbol for the reality, unless you understand the game. The actor assumes the actions, tones, dress, and words of certain characters, and if he is a good actor you forget the reality and laugh and weep, and otherwise feel that what you see is reality, although you really know underneath it all that it is only a play. And all this is mental suggestion. Remember, now and always, that a mental suggestion operates by the presentation of the outward symbol associated with the feeling to be induced. Put the right record in the phonograph and the corresponding sound is produced or induced. Do you see? This law underlies all the phenomena of mental suggestion. Understand the law of suggestion and you have the master key to the phenomena. Oratory, and other forms of appeal to the feeling by spoken words, gives us a typical example of the operation of this form of mental suggestion. The orator, the lawyer, the preacher, each uses words calculated to induce mental states, feelings, and emotions in the minds of his hearers. Such a one soon begins to learn the suggestive value of words, tones, and expression. He avoids the use of cold, abstract words, and drifts into the use of those which are symbols for deep feeling and emotion, knowing that these word symbols uttered with the proper tone and expression will induce the feelings for which they stand in the minds of the hearers. The hearer's emotions and feelings are played upon, in this way, like an instrument. The emotion or passion, whether it be love, fear, hate, greed, patriotism, courage, jealousy, sympathy, etc., etc., is awakened by the skillful use of the words, tones, and expression which stand as symbols for these feelings. If you will remember how you were touched by an address that afterwards seemed to you to be hyperbolic and flamboyant, without argument, proof or sense, then you will realize how you were made the subject of mental suggestion through association. The skillful salesman operates upon you in the same way. So does his twin brother, the advertising man. The revivalist has this reduced to a perfect science. Words, 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 inciters to action, inducers of feeling, symbol of mental states, and reproducers of mental states, despise them not, sneer not at them, for they have brought down low the mightiest of minds, when properly used. Even when written, their potency is great. Countries have often been made captive by a clever phrase, which when analyzed meant nothing in reason, merely an awakener of feeling. Let me make the catchphrases of a country, and I care not who makes its laws. The man best adapted to employ this form of suggestion is he who is more or less of an actor, that is, who possesses the faculty of throwing expression and feeling into words, actions, and manner. Good orators, pleaders, salesmen, and others have this faculty largely developed. It belongs to the feminine side of the phenomena, for it has the charming, drawing, leading aspect, and works by the employment of the emotive pole of mentation, rather the will or motive pole, as in the case of the first mentioned phase of suggestion, that of authoritative statement or command. It operates not by beating down the will of the other person, but rather by inducing a sympathetic rhythm of feeling and emotion, which overpowers his own will, and causes it to act accordingly. One should ever be on guard against this kind of influence. The best way to escape it is to adopt the policy of never acting immediately in response to an appeal of this kind. Rather wait until the effect has worn off, and then submit the matter to the consideration of your reason and judgment. Of course, the cultivation of willpower will act as a shield or armor, protecting you from the subtle vibrations of this kind, for this form of suggestion is usually accompanied by strong mentative currents from the mind of the speaker. Fence yourself off from a too ready response to sympathetic appeals along the emotional lines. Let the head stand by the heart, ready to prevent its running away with you. Men should have the reason in the ascendant, not the emotional nature. When you feel yourself being carried off of your feet by some emotional excitement, steady yourself and ask your mind this question: is this a mental suggestion? The question will tend to bring you to your state of equilibrium. When you know what a mental suggestion is, then you will learn to recognize them and be on the lookout for them. This state of mind will act as a strong neutralizing agent for the most skillfully put suggestion. Have your torpedo nets out, no matter how secure you may imagine yourself to be. One caution more: be especially cautious and slow to accept a suggestion when you are worn out, tired, or in a passive, pleasurable state, that is, whenever your will is resting, or else exhausted. On these occasions, when in doubt, say no. You will save yourself much regret by remembering this bit of advice. It is based on a proven psychological law. I have learned this law by bitter personal experience. Remember it. Let us consider the fourth line of action of mental suggestion. Suggestion through repetition. This form of mental suggestion is quite common, and the study of its manifestations is quite interesting, for it brings into operation a well-known psychological principle, which has its correspondences in the physical world. Constant dripping will wear away the hardest stone. You know the story of the man who told his favorite lie so often that he believed it himself. Well, this is a psychological fact. People have started to make a certain appearance of truth, in words, or manner, by assuming something to be true that was not so. Then they kept on repeating the thing, adding a little here, and a little there, until the thing got to be a fixed idea with them, and they actually believe it. And if a person can suggest himself into accepting a false belief in this way, you can see how it will operate on others. The secret of the operation of this form of suggestion lies in the psychological facts of weakened resistance through repetition of the attack, and the force of habit. The first time an unaccustomed suggestion is made, the mind sets up an active resistance, but the next time it is presented, the suggestion is not quite so unfamiliar as before, and a lessened resistance is set up, and so on, until at last no resistance is interposed, and the suggestion is accepted. You know the old verse. Vice is a monster of so frightful mien, that, to be hated, needs but to be seen. But seen too oft, familiar with her face. We first endure, then pity, then embrace. And this rule holds good with suggestions. We first resist them, then endure them, then accept them unless we understand the law. The psychological fact involved in this form of suggestion is that impressions upon brain cells become deepened by constant repetition. It is like sinking a die into a cake of wax, it goes deeper at each pressure. The mind is very apt to accept as true anything that it finds deeply impressed upon its records. It has become accustomed to finding these deep impressions only when they have been made by repeated efforts of its own intellect, or judgment, or experience, and so when it finds these deep impressions that have been placed there by repeated suggestions of others, it is not apt to discriminate. It finds itself feeling these things that have been repeatedly impressed upon it. Like the cuckoo's egg in the robin's nest, these illegitimate mental impressions are nurtured as one's very own. There is a constant struggle for existence upon the part of the ideas, or mental images impressed upon me. The strong crowd out the weak. And in the majority of cases, the strongest ones are those which have either been impressed in a vivid manner, or else by repetition. The second time you meet a man, you may have trouble in remembering him, but the third time it is easier, and so on, until at last you forget that he ever was a stranger. And so it is with these suggested ideas. You grow familiar with them through repetition, they lose their strangeness to you, and at last you cease to concern yourself about them. A strange thing is generally inspected, examined, viewed suspiciously, etc., but after the strangeness has worn off you cease to exercise the former caution. Familiarity breeds contempt, and also lack of caution. Suggestion gains force by each repetition. This is one of the fundamental laws of suggestion, and one that all should remember. If you would take mental stock of yourself, you would find that you entertain a vast number of feelings, ideas, and opinions, which you possess simply through this law of repeated suggestion. You have heard certain things affirmed, over and over again, until you have come to accept them as veritable facts, notwithstanding that you possess not the slightest personal knowledge of any logical proof concerning them. Shrewd molders of public opinion employ this law, and constantly repeat a certain thing, in varying words and style, until at last the public accepts it as a proven and unquestioned fact. Many a man has gained a reputation for wisdom, merely because his friends repeatedly affirmed it, and the public accepted the suggestion. Many a statesman has had a reputation built up for him by friendly newspaper correspondents, whose constantly repeated suggestions have caused the idea to crystallize into a material form in the public mind. And many a reputation has been destroyed by the repeated shrugs, sneers, and insinuations of gossips and evil wishers. Advertisers understand this law, and keep the repeated suggestion of the merit of their wares constantly before the public mind, until it becomes gospel with the people. If at first you don't succeed, and never take no for an answer, are two axioms very dear to the heart of the man who uses suggestion in his business. Do not be deceived by this subtle form of suggestion. Do not imagine that an untrue thing becomes true because it is repeated often. Do not allow your judgment to be lulled to sleep by this drowsy repetition of the slumber song. Keep awake, keep awake. An understanding of this law of suggestion will throw light on many things that have puzzled you heretofore. Think over it a bit, when you have time. Chapter 18. How Suggestion is Used. Let us now consider the various forms of application of suggestion in everyday life. They are several, and for convenience I separate them into three forms, or groups, i.e., 1. Involuntary suggestion, 2. Voluntary suggestion, and 3. Autosuggestion. Let us now consider the first form. Involuntary suggestion. By this term I mean the use of suggestion involuntarily, without a particular purpose, or unconsciously. We are giving suggestions of words, manner, action, etc., every moment of our lives. And these suggestions are constantly being accepted by those around us. We are constantly influencing those with whom we come in contact, the greater part of the work being performed unconsciously by us. We are acting as living inspiration for some, and living discouragement for others, according to circumstances. Our moods, actions, words, appearance, manners, etc., act as suggestions to those around us. I am not now speaking of the effect of mentative currents, etc., but of mental suggestion, pure and simple. A business house is permeated by the personality of its head, and his personal characteristics impress themselves upon those under him, by the means of suggestion. He sets the gait of the place. If he is active and enterprising, so are the workers employed by him, and if he is careless and shiftless, so will they be apt to be. We affect those around us by our mental attitudes, manifested in action, and they affect us if we allow them to do so. Children are quite amenable to suggestion of this sort, being natural imitators, and they soon take on the mental attitude of the parents toward them. If the parent treats the child as being beyond control, the child will respond. If the child be considered obstinate, etc., he will take on the suggestion, and the original trouble will be magnified. People talk before their children, little realizing that their little minds are very suggestible, and are constantly taking suggestive color from those around them. People should endeavor to present to their children only the best, positive, helpful, uplifting, and encouraging mental states. They should avoid giving the child the impression that it is bad, or mean, or deceitful, or shy, or anything of that sort. The child will be apt to accept the suggestion coming from a source that it naturally looks to for information, and it will be very apt to proceed to act upon the suggestion and make the words of the parent come true. I have heard of children who had become so impressed with their parents' suggestion that they would come to some bad end, yet, that they had to fight against it the balance of their lives. Sow the suggestive seeds that you desire to sprout into reality, be careful to select the right kind. This subject of suggestion to children can be merely alluded to here, for it would fill a book of itself. I felt impelled to say a few words about it in this lesson, because my experience has taught me its extreme importance. This is the rule of involuntary suggestion. Our words, actions, manner, tones, appearance, and general personality convey suggestions to those around us, inducing mental states in accordance therewith. Therefore, act out only the character that you wish to impress upon the world, and act it the best you know how. The world will connect you with the part you are playing, according to the suggestions thus made. Sometimes you will get a better verdict than you really deserve, sometimes a worse one, but in either event, your mental attitude, reflected by your involuntary suggestions, will have caused the verdict, whatever it may be. Therefore, form a correct mental attitude, based upon some ideal of the part you wish to play, and then play it out to the best of your ability. Observe the outward appearance of the part you are playing, for this is what the world sees first, last and all the time, and you are judged by your suggestive makeup and stage action. Act well your part, for thereupon rests the verdict of the audience. The second form of the application of suggestion is voluntary suggestion. This form of the application of suggestion is manifested in cases in which the suggestion is deliberately and purposely made with the end of impressing other persons. Its manifestations may be grouped into three classes, as follows: A. Suggestive treatment. B. Hypnotic suggestion. C. Suggestion in the form of personal influence. By A. Suggestive treatment I refer to the practice of mental suggestion used as a form of treatment for physical ills, or mental deficiencies, etc. The treatments for physical ills come under the term of mental therapeutics, and will be spoken of in the chapter bearing that title. Treatment by suggestion for mental deficiencies, etc., is a branch of science that is rapidly coming to the fore. For some time it was clouded by its mistaken connection with hypnotism, but now that it has been divorced therefrom, it is being used to a much greater degree by scientists in all parts of the world. Its principle rests on the fact that brain centers and brain cells may be grown, developed, and increased by properly directed suggestions, so that one may be practically made over mentally. New qualities may be induced, and objectionable ones decreased. Objectionable habits and traits may be eliminated, and desirable ones substituted or newly induced. The wonders of this form of practical psychology are being unfolded rapidly, and a great era is before us in this branch of science. The broad principle of the treatment lies in the fact that the mental states induced by the proper suggestion tend to exercise and develop the portion of the brain in which they are manifested. Hence the theory once understood, and the best method adopted, the rest of the treatment becomes as simple as developing any muscle of the body by the appropriate exercise. I call this form of treatment brain building, by suggestion, etc. B. Suggestion in hypnotism is a subject that I shall merely refer to here, for this is not a manual of hypnotism. Sufficient it is to say that hypnotism is a combination of the use of mentative energy in a certain form, coupled with suggestion. It is a proven psychological fact that in the hypnotic condition, all suggestions have a greatly exaggerated effect, and a suggestion that would scarcely be noticed in the ordinary state becomes a strong motive force to one in the state of hypnosis. In this state the most absurd suggestions are accepted, and acted upon, the most extraordinary delusions are entertained, and the suggestions of future action, or post-hypnotic suggestions, are made effective. I wish to caution my students against allowing themselves to be hypnotized for experimental or other purposes. It is conducive to negative conditions, and I heartily disapprove of the practice. I would not allow anyone to hypnotize me, and I would urge upon my students a similar attitude toward experimenters. The best effects of suggestion may be obtained without hypnosis, the latter is merely an abnormal and morbid state, most undesirable to normal people. Let it alone. C. Suggestion in personal influence is referred to in other parts of this work, and appears more fully in the chapters treating of personal influence, for it belongs to that phase of the general subject. The third form of application of suggestion is what is known as Autosuggestion. By this term is mental self-suggestion, or suggestions given by one to his own mind. This is a most interesting and important phase of the subject, and will be dealt with fully in the chapters on mental architecture, etc., under which head it falls. It is by autosuggestions that so many people have made themselves over, mentally, and have become that which they will to be. Its principles are precisely the same as in the other forms of suggestion, except that the treatment is given by oneself instead of by another person. The vehicles of suggestion, i.e., the voice, the manner, etc., have been alluded to in other chapters as we proceeded. An eminent teacher of the use of suggestion in commercial pursuits, in speaking of the effect of suggestion in inducing mental states, says, "You can make a man think with you if you work on his feelings or higher nature, even though you run counter to his ordinary judgment. If in this way you can dazzle his reason sufficiently, you can spur him to almost any action of which man is capable." And this teacher is perfectly right in his statement, although he follows the old subjective mind idea and identifies feeling with the higher nature, instead of treating it as belonging to the emotive pole of mentation. And, if I may be pardoned, I would suggest that the above statement would be a little nearer the true state of affairs if he had said, "You can make a man feel with you if you work on his emotive mentality," etc. The teachers of business psychology very ably instruct their pupils in the art of suggestion in the process of making sales. They instruct the salesman to first gain the prospective customer's attention, then arouse his interest, then awaken desire, and then close the sale. These steps in the psychology of salesmanship apply equally well to the science of advertising, or any other appeal to the minds of people, and are logically correct. The attention once gained, the mind becomes more or less receptive. The mind once receptive, interest is aroused and a greater degree of receptivity is induced. Interest is gradually led to desire, induced by the subtle suggestion of words and the exhibition of the article to be sold, and at last, when the proper psychological state is aroused, the trained salesman gently but firmly gives the positive suggestion of authority, or demand, pointing to the place where the customer must sign his name, thus using suggestion along both the lines of acquiescence and imitation, and the order is taken. Did you ever subscribe to a book at the solicitation of a good book agent? Well, if you did, and will let your mind run backward over the proceeding, you will see how the above rule works in practice. 1. Attention. 2. Interest. 3. Desire. 4. Sale. These are the steps of salesmanship by suggestion, and advertising sales as well. Great is suggestion in business. I have known salesmen to gently suggest the closing of a sale by handing the customer a fountain pen, placed at the suggestive slant, at the same time pointing to the space on the order blank, with the take it for granted tone and utterance, "Sign right here, please." And it was signed. The largest employers of agents have regular training schools, in which the new agents are given the benefit of the experience of the old hands at the business, and some of these old hands could give a professional suggestionist points on his own science. The agent is told how the different classes of people act, the objections they will be likely to raise, and how the trained agent may overcome these obstacles by clever work, including, of course, an intelligent use of suggestion. The average person would be surprised at the ideas advanced and the knowledge of suggestion possessed by some of these men. One of these agents once told me that one of the first things he learned when starting to work was that the agent should never permit the customer to take his prospectus, or sample pages, in his own hands. He said to me, "I always keep the prospectus in my own hands, for if I let it get away from me I will have lost the power of controlling the attention and interest of the customer. He will then have the matter in his own hands, and will have gotten away from me. He will then do the leading, instead of my doing it. I always keep the upper hand of my man or woman. I do the leading, guiding, directing and influencing myself. I keep the controlling gear in my own hands, always." And, in the science of advertising, also, there is a constant use of suggestion, usually conscious and premeditated. This is taught in the courses and schools of advertising, and their ad Men are well grounded on the subject. The use of the direct command, as the ad men call it, is very common. People are positively told to do certain things in these advertisements. They are told to take home a cake of Hinky-Dink soap tonight, your wife needs it. And they do it. Or they see a mammoth hand pointing down at them from a sign, and almost hear the corresponding mammoth voice, as it says, in painted words say, you smoke honeydope cigars, they're the best ever. And, if you manage to reject the command the first time, you will probably yield at the repeated suggestion of the same thing being hurled at you at every corner and high fence, and honeydope will be your favorite brand until some other suggestion catches you. Suggestion by authority and repetition, remember, that's what does the business for you. They call this the direct command in the advertising schools. Then there are other subtle forms of suggestion in advertising. You see staring from every bit of space, on billboard and in newspapers and magazines, you want a cracker, or something of that sort, and you usually wind up by acquiescing. And then you are constantly told that babies howl for Grandma Hankins' infantile soother, and then when you hear some baby howling you think of what you have been told they are howling for, and then you run and buy a bottle of Grandma Hankins. And then you are told that some cigar is generously liberal in size and quality, or that some kind of cocoa is grateful and refreshing, or that some brand of soap is 99.999% pure, and that some pickle man makes 763 varieties, etc., etc., etc. Only last night I saw a new one, somebody's whiskey is smooth, and every imbiber in the car was smacking his lips and thinking about the smooth feeling in his mouth and throat. It was smooth, the idea, not the stuff, I mean. And some other whiskey man shows a picture of a glass, a bottle, some ice and a siphon of seltzer, with simply these words, Old Boy's Highball, that's all. All of these things are suggestions, and some of them very powerful ones, too, when constantly impressed upon the mind by repetition. They get in their work on you. A writer on the psychology of advertising advises, among other things, that advertisements of articles to eat or drink should contain the words calculated to induce the feeling of taste in the minds of the readers. Sweet, refreshing, thirst-quenching, nourishing, etc., etc. How suggestive they are. And how effective. How do they act? You ask. How? Well, this way, just you read these words. A nice, big juicy lemon tart and strong, I can taste it now. Just imagine these words accompanied by a picture of a man squeezing the juice of a lemon into his mouth, and where are you? I'll tell you where. Your mouth is filled with saliva, from the imagined taste of the tart lemon juice. Now, isn't it? Tell this to some of your friends and see how it works. I once heard a story of a bad little boy, who would stand in front of a German band, with a lemon to his mouth, sucking away vigorously. Result, the mouths of the musicians became filled with so much saliva that they could not play on. Exit boy, with Professor Umper, the bass horn player, in full pursuit, the air being filled with Dunner and Blitzen, and worse. Just suggestion. I have known of dealers in spring goods to force the season by filling their windows with the advance stock. I have seen hat dealers start up the straw hat season by putting on a straw themselves, their clerks ditto, and then a few friends. The sprinkling of straws gave the suggestion to the street, and the straw hat season was opened. Businessmen understand suggestion. Even the newsboys understand it. The best ones are above asking as the novices do, want a paper, mister? Or worse still, you don't want a paper, mister, do you? The good ones say, instead, boldly and confidently, here's your paper, mister, sticking it under your nose, and you take it. Let me tell you a tale about a barker at a pleasure resort in Chicago, several years ago. He was the best I ever heard. Here is the story, it's a true one. This man was the barker or spieler for one of the attractions of the place, the pony ride attraction. Many were the ponies lined up to carry the children around the ring, for a nickel a ride. The spieler would wait until a crowd of children, with or without their parents, would enter the place, and then he would begin in the strongest, most strenuous, rasping, suggestive tone. Ride, ride, ride. Have a ride, take a ride, have a ride, take a ride. Anybody, everybody, anybody, everybody. Ride, ride, ride. Anybody rides, everybody rides, 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 rides. Take a ride, have a ride, take a ride, have a ride, take a ride, have a ride. Anybody, everybody, anybody, everybody ride, ride, ride. 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 He would keep this sort of thing up for several minutes, apparently without taking a fresh breath. The very air seemed to quiver and vibrate in the rhythm of his ride, ride. And every child within hearing who could raise a nickel would surely ride. The word ride, positively, authoritatively, and constantly repeated, was one of the most startling exhibitions of this form of suggestion that I have ever seen or heard. I have heard many imitators of this spieler, but have never met his equal. Perhaps he has now passed on to some higher form of usefulness. He was worthy of it. He was a master, surely. I have seen men in bowling alleys caused to make false plays by some bystander suggesting the false shot. The same thing is true in shooting galleries, etc. You have but to look around you and see these, everyday instances of suggestion, in some form or other. Induced feeling, remember. That is the key of all manifestations of suggestion. Look out for it. And, in conclusion, I know of a little boy who exemplified the law of suggestion one April Fool's Day by placing a sign on the coat tail of another boy. The sign read, "Kick me." And they did. The skillful lawyer uses suggestion in his work in examining or cross-examining witnesses. He suggests things to a suggestible witness, and coaxes and leads him on to admissions and statements that he did not intend making, sometimes statements that are not strictly correct. Such a one will say, "You did so and so," or "You saw so and so, didn't you," etc., the direct statement made in an authoritative manner, causing the suggestible witness to acquiesce. Look out for this confident, authoritative manner, in a lawyer or anyone else. It is calculated to lead one into acquiescence, for man is an obedient animal, and it is so much easier to say yes than no. When you see that yes is expected. It is charged that police detectives have worked false confessions out of suggestible criminals in this way, by keeping hammering away at them until their wills are worn out, and they would say yes, to escape further questioning, like the girl who finally accepted the lover's repeated proposal in order to get rid of him. This firm, decided, authoritative statement or demand, when allied to the law of repetition, has caused much mischief in the world, and many have given in to it, to their sorrow. I trust that these warning words will save some other trouble of this kind. When the law is once understood, it is comparatively easy to escape the suggestion. The strength in the suggester of this kind lies in the ignorance of the person suggested. Forewarned is forearmed, in this case. I have heard of businessmen who would instruct their clerks to ask questions of their customers in this way: "You like this pattern, do you not? Or this is a beautiful shade, is it not?" etc., etc., etc. Do you see the point? The statement is made first, and the question is asked right on top of it. Isn't it easier to say yes than no to this kind of a question? See there, now, I asked the question in that way, myself, although I had no intention of doing so. I took my own suggestion. In this connection, I may add that it is a well-known psychological fact that, when two persons are conversing, the one standing, or sitting higher than the other, has the advantage of a certain positive attitude or position. And the person seated below the speaker is forced into a relatively passive or negative condition, or position. That is, everything else being equal, the person elevated will be positive to the other, and the one seated on a lower level will be passive, relatively. The raised platform of the teacher, speaker, preacher, etc., has a good psychological basis. And the power that a lawyer feels when talking on his feet to the jury seated in front of him is a manifestation of a law that he may not be aware of, but the judge has the best of the lawyer, for the latter must look up to him when he talks. Try the experiment of practicing the above position with some friend, first one being seated and then the other, and see how you can actually feel the difference between the two positions. The raised position of clerks in the large stores, and the low seats so accommodatingly placed for the customers, have good reasons. If you ever feel that someone is placing you in a negative or passive condition, rise to your feet, and you will feel doubly strong and forceful. This is a little hint that may be worth many times the price of this book to you, some of these days. Look over the foolish things that you have been talked or influenced into, and see if you were not seated and the other person standing, or seated higher than you. This is a little thing, but it works big results, sometimes. Better heed it. There is a great difference in the suggestibility of persons, some being almost immune from suggestion, while others are so suggestible that they have but to be told a thing in a positive, forceful, confident, authoritative tone and manner, to accept the suggestion, particularly if it be repeated several times. They will likewise readily absorb the suggestions of imitation and association. But I have told you about this elsewhere in this lesson. Study those around you, and you will soon discover the different degrees. The hypnotic subject is at the extreme negative end of the scale. I now wish to call your attention to what may be called future suggestion, or, as the hypnotists call it, post-hypnotism, etc. Future suggestions are like seeds planted in the mind, which grow, blossom and bear fruit at some future time. The hypnotists produce this phenomena by giving the subject, while in the hypnotic condition, the suggestion that at a certain time, either in a few minutes, or hours, or days, he will do certain things, or feel certain things. But the newer school of psychologists have discovered that these future suggestions may be made in the ordinary receptive state, just as is the case with any of the other forms of mental suggestions, and the result will be the same as that obtained by the hypnotists, in spite of their theories and methods. I do not purpose going into detail regarding this class of phenomena, because all that is necessary to be said can be comprised in the following two statements. 1. That, generally speaking, all the phenomena of the ordinary immediate mental suggestion may be produced as future suggestion. And 2. That all the phenomena of future suggestion, produced by the suggester upon another person, may be likewise produced by autosuggestions, that is, by the person inducing suggestions in himself. Many foolish suggestions are given in everyday life along the lines of future suggestion, and alas, many of them are accepted carelessly, owing to a lack of knowledge of the principle. How many times has it been said to an impressionable young bride, "Never mind, you'll grow tired of him after a while," etc. Or to a man, "Wait until the novelty wears off and you'll see how sick of the job you'll get." Or, "You'll lose your interest and enthusiasm, by and by." Or, "You'll find him out after a while and will see that he's not what he seems." And so on. You may add to these instances from your own experience. And too often these suggestions are recalled and have a tendency to cause the person to make them come true. Many fortune tellers' prophecies have been made come true in this way by impressionable and ignorant people. I have given you a key to this principle. Now, heed the lesson. If you feel that an attempt at future impression is being made on you, neutralize it with a mental "No, I won't." That is the antidote for the bane. The second principle in the statement made several paragraphs further back, i.e., that all the phenomena of future suggestion may be duplicated by autosuggestion, or suggestions made by oneself, is true and worthy of consideration. You make up your mind that you must awaken to catch a train at 4 tomorrow morning and you awaken in time. You have set your mental alarm clock. If you have an engagement at 3 this afternoon, you may set your alarm as follows, talking to yourself, "Of course now, see here. Remember that you must see Smith at 3 this afternoon. 3, I say. Remember now, 3, I say. And if you impress it sufficiently strong upon your mind, a little before 3 you will begin to feel uneasy, and then suddenly your Smith engagement will pop into your mind from your subconscious region, and you will reach out for your hat and overcoat mental alarm clock. Remember? That tells the whole tale. You see, the experimenter giving future suggestions simply sets the mental alarm clock going along the lines of suggestion. He makes the mental suggestion and attaches it to the mental alarm clock. When the alarm goes off, the suggestion emerges into the field of consciousness and acts just as if it had been freshly made. That's the whole story in plain, homely terms. But don't be frightened, you timid people. Remember this, that you will not accept a future suggestion unless you would also accept a present suggestion. The degree of suggestibility is the same in both cases. The only reason a future suggestion has the advantage over a present one is that it is more subtle, and people are not as much on guard about future things as they are about things to be done right now. You will resent a suggestion that you do this thing right now, while you pay but little attention to the earnest suggestion that in a year from now you will feel so-and-so about this matter, and dismiss the subject with a shrug of the shoulders, instead of saying, at least mentally, no, I won't. The present suggestion is apt to attract your attention the more forcibly, because it is more apparent, while the future suggestion is more insinuating. But now that you know the facts of the matter, you may laugh at them both, and take the sting out of them by your little "No, I won't." And, just one word more. If you feel that you are harboring any future suggestions made on you in the past, but upon which the alarm has not yet gone off, you may kill them by direct self-suggestion, or autosuggestions to the contrary. That is, you may say, I shall not act upon any adverse suggestions that may have been made to me, I will them out of my mind, I kill them this moment by the power of my will. And at the same time make a mental picture of the suggestion being obliterated by the action of your will, just as the chalk mark is erased from the blackboard by the passing over it of the eraser. Try this plan and be free.